Ruth didn't know which part of her body reacted first, her hands or her breath. One moment she was wiping down the dining table in her little LA apartment, humming softly under her breath, and the next she was frozen in place as her phone buzzed with a notification she didn't recognize. A video file, no message, no name, just a clip. She tapped it. The world dropped out from under her feet. The grainy glow of night vision illuminated a familiar face, young, curious, and entirely unaware that he was being recorded. Her heartbeat, her pride, her entire world. He was creeping past trimmed hedges and modern stone pathways. In the background, she recognized the layout instantly, the wide steps, the glass walls, the way the lights washed over that massive courtyard. She whispered a name she hadn't spoken aloud in years, Stevens. Her knees weakened. Her son was not just wandering somewhere he shouldn't be. He was inside the private estate of the man who once walked out of their lives and never made his way back. The phone slipped in her hand. Her throat tightened. Her pulse thumped in her ears so loudly she could barely hear the faint audio from the recording. "Connor, why would you go there?" she breathed, gripping the counter for balance. She replayed the clip, hoping she was wrong. She wasn't. That was Stevens's home, the property she left behind when she packed her bags all those years ago, choosing peace instead of begging a grown man to be a father. Now her boy, her gentle, curious, brilliant boy, was inside that world as if he belonged there. The pressure in her chest grew heavier. Was he safe? Was security going to stop him? Was Stevens going to see him? The video ended abruptly, leaving Ruth staring at her reflection on the dark screen. Eyes wide, breath shallow, heart pounding with a mixture of fear, confusion, and something she hated to name, hurt. She clutched the phone to her chest and whispered, "God, please protect my child," because one truth slammed into her harder than anything else. If Stevens found Connor before she did, the past she spent 13 years trying to bury was about to rise right back into her life. Ruth's phone lit up again, this time with a call. Unknown number. Her stomach flipped. She almost let it ring out. But something in her spirit nudged her thumb toward the green button. "Hello?" she breathed. The voice on the other end wasn't one she expected to hear again in this lifetime. "Ruth." Stevens's voice cracked. The same man who once spoke with confidence, charm, and a smooth tone that melted her back in their younger days. Tonight he sounded shaken, unsteady. "Where's Connor?" he demanded softly, breath tight, like fear was gripping him by the collar. Ruth froze. Her grip tightened on the phone. She couldn't form an answer. Stevens exhaled sharply. "Ruth, I'm not asking to argue. I'm asking because he's here." A trembling breath. "He's inside my property. Right now." Her world blurred. "What?" The word broke out of her throat, thin and terrified. She didn't need confirmation. She had just seen the footage, but hearing Stevens say it out loud made her feel like her chest was caving in. "Come now," he urged. "He's scared. I'm trying to get to him before security does." Ruth didn't hear anything else. Not the rest of what Stevens tried to explain, not the background noise on his end. Nothing. She was already running. Her keys rattled as she snatched them off the counter. Her purse swung against her hip. Her apartment door slammed behind her. By the time she reached the parking lot, she was in full panic. "Lord, please don't let anything happen to my baby," she whispered through trembling breaths. It wasn't a prayer she spoke often, but tonight it escaped her without thought. As she sped onto the main road, Los Angeles lights streaked across her windshield. Traffic buzzed. Sirens echoed somewhere far off, faint, but enough to spike her anxiety even higher. She pressed harder on the gas. Her hands tightened around the steering wheel as if holding it too loosely might cost her everything. Every turn felt longer. Every red light felt unfair. Every block felt like a mile. Her chest refused to settle because she knew one thing with absolute certainty. No matter how messy the past was, no matter how deep the hurt ran, no matter how far Stevens drifted from the father he should been, Connor was still her baby, her world, her responsibility. And nothing, not heartbreak, not distance, not years of silence, was going to stop her from reaching him. Not tonight, not ever. There are moments in life that shake our entire foundation, moments when the truth we've tried to protect suddenly stands right in front of us. no longer waiting for permission. Ruth wasn't just racing across Los Angeles. She was racing toward a reality she never wanted her son to face so soon. And that brings us to you watching this right now. Let me ask you something. Have you ever tried so hard to shield your child, or someone you love, from a painful truth, only for life to expose it anyway? Maybe it was a secret you hoped could wait. Maybe it was a person you hoped they'd never need to see hurting again. Or maybe it was a chapter you hoped was closed for good. But life has a way of bringing things full circle, especially the things we leave unfinished. Let me ask you this too. Have you ever carried a hurt so heavy that seeing the person who broke you brings back every feeling at once? Ruth was feeling all of that in one breath. Fear for her son, rage at Stevens, and a deep buried wound rising to the surface after 13 long years. Because sometimes life doesn't wait until we're ready. It confronts us at the exact moment we want to run from the past the most. And whether we admit it or not, we all know what that feels like. Every family has a breaking point, and sometimes that breaking point reveals the truth everyone tried to ignore. Ruth spent 13 years holding everything together on her own, making sure Connor felt loved, making sure he felt whole, making sure he never carried the weight of his father's mistakes. She wanted peace. She wanted stability. She wanted her son to grow up with confidence instead of confusion. Stevens, on the other hand, built an empire. He filled his life with meetings, business trips, rooftop events, and success stories. It looked glamorous from the outside, but inside he carried a silence he refused to examine. Instead of facing regret, he buried it. Instead of reaching out, he stayed busy. Instead of being a father, he convinced himself that distance was easier. Two people coping in two different ways, two people trying to protect themselves in the only ways they knew how. But Connor, he wasn't trying to protect anything. He was curious, hurting. And that search, that single act of bravery mixed with confusion, forced a confrontation Ruth and Stevens could no longer avoid. Now the truth was rising. Past choices, hidden pain, unspoken questions, all of it. This wasn't just about a boy walking onto private property. This was a family torn apart by pride finally facing the moment they had both been running from. And whether they were ready or not, their lives were about to change. There are nights when the truth doesn't knock, it breaks the door open. Tonight was one of those nights for Ruth. She didn't know what she would find when she reached that mansion. She didn't know how Stevens would react to seeing his son after so many years. She didn't know how Connor would process the moment he met the man who existed in his life only as a name. But what she was about to discover inside that estate, it would shake her heart, confront old wounds, and reshape the meaning of family in ways she never expected. The truth wasn't going to be gentle, but it was necessary. And if you stay with this story until the end, you will see how one moment, one hidden camera, reopened a past they all thought was buried and revealed emotions they could no longer hide. Before we continue, please like this video and comment below. It helps YouTube push this story out so more people can enjoy it. Your support truly helps this channel grow and allows more powerful stories to reach new viewers. Welcome back to Stories by Mr. Flex, where life's most powerful lessons come wrapped in unforgettable tales. If you're new to this family, thank you for joining us. Please hit the subscribe button because it helps us share stories like this right here on YouTube. Morning sunlight slipped through the thin curtains of Ruth's modest Los Angeles apartment, warming the room in soft gold. The apartment wasn't big. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with cabinets that creaked whenever she opened them. But it was home. It smelled like cinnamon oatmeal and a faint hint of the lavender candle she liked to burn at night. It was the kind of place built with love, resilience, and small victories. Ruth stood at the stove in her kitchen, flipping pancakes while humming an old R&B song under her breath. Her body moved with the muscle memory of a parent who'd done this routine 1,000 times. Early breakfast, packed lunches, one eye always on the clock, the other on her child. Behind her, Connor sat on the couch, long legs stretched out, brown curls falling into his eyes as he tapped away at his phone. 13. Somehow those years passed faster than she imagined. He'd grown so tall lately that half the time she wondered where her little boy had gone. "Connor," she called softly. You want blueberries or chocolate chips? He didn't look up. Chocolate chips. Baby, look at me when I'm talking to you. Ruth frowned a little. He'd been acting distant all week, not in a moody teenage attitude way, more like he was carrying something he wasn't ready to say out loud. He wasn't rude or withdrawn, he was distracted, lost in thought. His eyes seemed to drift whenever she spoke. She plated his breakfast with care and set it in front of him. Eat. You haven't been eating much lately. I'm fine, Ma, he mumbled, poking at the pancakes. No, you're not, she said gently. Talk to me. He opened his mouth, then paused, glancing at his phone again. It's nothing. Just stuff like what? Just school things. Not serious. Ruth didn't push further, not yet. She knew her son. Sometimes pressing too hard made him shut down completely. She would circle back later, when he wasn't guarding himself so tightly. If motherhood taught her anything, it was patience. She sat beside him, letting the silence stretch softly between them as he ate. The world outside buzzed with typical LA noise, traffic humming, neighbors chatting in Spanish through open windows, someone blasting music from their car below. Life in their neighborhood always had a heartbeat. But Ruth's mind drifted to last night again, the footage she had watched, the way her heart nearly stopped, the way her hands trembled as she sped toward the mansion. She hadn't slept since. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Connor on that security clip, stepping into the yard of the man she once loved. She hadn't spoken to Stephen since that moment in his foyer, the moment she confronted him, shaking, furious, terrified. She didn't stay long. She took Connor's hand and didn't look back. But her heart was still unsettled. This morning, every sound felt sharper, every shadow felt heavier. She wasn't paranoid. She was a mother, and mothers do not forget what fear feels like. She glanced at Connor again. He wasn't smiling like he normally did. He wasn't humming while he ate. He wasn't teasing her the way he normally did every morning. He was quiet, too quiet. Connor, she said softly, if something's wrong, you can tell me. His fork paused midair. I said I'm fine. It wasn't rude, just defensive. You sure? He nodded slowly, then took another bite. But she could see it, the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes shifted, the way he looked at the door like he was somewhere else in his mind. Something had changed. Ruth tried to ground herself in the routine of the morning. She washed dishes while Connor went to get dressed, folded laundry while he searched for his missing sneakers, and packed his lunch with care, a turkey sandwich, apple slices, and one of her handwritten notes she always tucked in. Have a good day. I love you. She hoped it would make him smile. Ma, I'm heading out, he called from the door. She rushed forward. Hold up. You think you're leaving without a hug? He rolled his eyes with a smile, but he wrapped his arms around her. His hugs were getting stronger now, more grown than childlike, but he always softened a little when he leaned into her. Be careful at school, she whispered. I will, and text me when you get there. I know. Don't I know me, she said with a gentle tap to his shoulder. Do it. He nodded, opened the door, then paused for a split second. Ruth noticed it, the little hesitation like he wanted to say something else. Connor? She asked. He blinked. Nothing. See you after school. He left, and her stomach turned with a silent ache she hadn't felt in years, the ache of not knowing what her child was hiding. Once the apartment quieted down, Ruth grabbed her bag and headed to work. Her job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. She worked as an assistant at a community center near downtown Los Angeles, helping with schedules, programs, and youth activities. It was steady work, and she was proud of it. She walked through the familiar streets, murals on brick walls, food vendors setting up early stands, kids rushing to catch buses, the city vibrating with its usual mix of cultures and sounds. LA was home in a way she couldn't fully explain. It was chaotic, loud, unpredictable, but it held memories of both her heartbreak and her healing. As she approached the community center, her coworker waved. Morning, Ruth. You good? Trying to be, she answered honestly. You seem tense. Just didn't sleep well. She didn't elaborate. She packed away the footage, the fear, Stevens's voice, the mansion, all of it, deep into the back of her mind, at least for the moment. But the contrast between her world and Stevens's world crept into her thoughts without permission. Stevens lived on a hilltop, a mansion with a driveway longer than her entire block, glass windows taller than her ceiling, a yard that looked like something out of a magazine. A life built on money, status, and decisions she was never part of. She had walked away from that world when she left him, pregnant, heartbroken, and determined to raise Connor on her own terms. The truth was simple, even if painful. She chose motherhood, and she'd chosen it again and again every single day since. But last night changed something. She could sense that threads from the past were returning, threads she never asked to pick up again, and all of it connected to her son. Later that afternoon, she picked up Connor from school. He climbed into the car with that same soft quiet, not unhappy but distracted. "How was school?" Ruth asked. "Fine. What'd you eat?" "Nachos. Did you finish your homework? Did most of it?" Ruth narrowed her eyes. "Connor," he shrugged. "I'll finish the rest later." They rode in silence for a bit. The city passed by, palm trees lining the sidewalks, a taco truck parked near a street corner, a skater weaving between pedestrians. But Ruth paid none of it any attention. "Baby," she said finally, "you need to tell me what's weighing on you." He stared out the window. Softly, he said, "Ma, you ever wonder what it's like on the other side?" "What do you mean?" "Like other neighborhoods, other lives, other families." Ruth's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Is this about him?" Connor glanced at her, then looked away quickly. "I just wonder sometimes," Ruth breathed out slowly. "That's natural, but you don't talk about him much because," she paused. The truth settled right behind her teeth. "Because she still remembers the night he told her he wasn't ready. Because she held Connor alone while Stevens built his empire. Because she didn't want her son to grow up feeling unwanted. Instead, she said, because I didn't want my pain to become yours." Connor didn't respond, but his silence spoke loudly. By the time they reached home, Ruth was sure of one thing. Something was shifting. Her son wasn't just curious, he was searching. She could see it in the way he moved, the way he asked questions without asking, the way he sat quietly at dinner, lost in thought. As the night settled in, Connor disappeared into his room. Ruth sat at the table staring at the spot where he usually laughed and talked. She could feel the distance growing. Not emotional rejection, but the pull of a boy who wanted answers. And she feared where that pull might lead. She whispered into the quiet apartment, "Lord, please guide him, and guide me," because Ruth sensed something she couldn't ignore. Her son was drifting toward a world she left behind, and somewhere across town, in a mansion glowing under LA moonlight, a man she once loved was probably thinking about the same child she tucked into bed every night. The past wasn't done with them, not at all. Saturday morning arrived with that warm, dry Los Angeles breeze that carried the scent of food trucks, street vendors, and the faint rhythm of music echoing from neighborhood blocks. Ruth always loved these kinds of days, days that reminded her of community, of joy, of life beyond the struggles she carried. And today was Festival Day. Every year, the local neighborhoods hosted a cultural festival at a nearby park, filled with music, food stalls, art vendors, and families gathered under the shade of tall palm trees. It was the kind of event where strangers became friends for a day, and kids ran around with painted faces, cotton candy smeared on their cheeks. Ruth decided that she and Connor needed to be out there. He needed fresh air. Maybe it would loosen whatever was troubling him. "Come on, baby, let's go," she called from the doorway. Connor dragged his feet, backpack slung over one shoulder. "Do we have to go?" "Yes," she answered with a small smile, "because staying cooped up in that room is not good for your brain. Or mine." He exhaled, somewhere between a sigh and a laugh, and followed her out. The festival buzzed with energy the moment they arrived. Kids chased each other with bubble wands. A jazz band played near the fountain, their horns bright and lively. A line wrapped around a food truck serving hot links and cornbread. Laughter floated through the air. Ruth's shoulders relaxed for the first time in days. She nudged Connor. "See, this is good for us." He nodded, eyes trailing the crowd. A local vendor called out to her. "Hey, Ruth, I got your kettle corn fresh today." She waved. "You trying to ruin my diet?" "What diet?" the man yelled jokingly. "You too tiny for that." Connor cracked a small smile, and Ruth's heart eased a bit. They wandered through different booths, handmade jewelry, t-shirts celebrating LA culture, paintings of city skylines, and tables selling empanadas and barbecue ribs. Ruth bought Connor a snow cone, watching the blue syrup stain his tongue. For a moment they felt like any other family enjoying a simple Saturday, but all it took was one song to shift Ruth's thoughts. The jazz band transitioned into an old Motown classic, a song she hadn't heard in years, a song connected to a different time, a different version of herself. Her chest tightened, and before she could stop it, a memory unfolded. Ruth was 22, nervous and hopeful, attending a community tech meetup in downtown LA. She wasn't a tech genius, but she loved seeing new ideas, new designs, new ways of creating futures. The room was filled with young professionals, some nerdy, some confident, some pretending to be confident. And then she saw him, Stevens. He wasn't the billionaire he would become. He was just a young man with ambition in his eyes and a shy smile that melted her guard immediately. He had sandy hair that fell over his forehead whenever he laughed, and he laughed often. He stood at a table demonstrating a small coding project he was proud of, his first app prototype. It wasn't perfect, but Ruth saw his excitement, his passion, and she found herself drawn to him. He noticed her staring and walked over. "You're judging my app, aren't you?" he teased. She raised an eyebrow. "Is it supposed to do that weird glitching thing?" He laughed, a real, genuine laugh that filled the room. "That's a feature," he said, "a very, very unplanned feature." From that moment they clicked. They spent the rest of the evening talking, about dreams, about their childhoods, about the things they wanted to build. He told her he wanted to change the world through technology. She told him she wanted to help communities thrive. He asked her out that night. Their first date was at Venice Beach. They walked barefoot in the sand, holding milkshakes, talking for hours until the sky shifted from pink to midnight blue. Stevens had a way of listening that made her feel seen, loved, valued. Ruth hadn't felt that in a long time. Back at the festival, Ruth blinked away the memory, but the flashbacks came faster. They were in their tiny apartment back then, sharing cheap takeout on the living room floor, laughing about nothing and everything. Stevens suddenly stood up, grabbed her hand, and pulled her to her feet. "What are you doing?" She laughed. "Dancing," he said. "To no music? I'm the music." And with a clumsy spin and awkward rhythm, he proved it. She laughed harder than she had in years. He kissed her gently. They danced until the takeout turned cold. Ruth remembered the warmth of his hands, the way he whispered "I love you" in her ear when he thought she was asleep, the way he encouraged her to pursue her passions. That was the Stevens she fell for, before fear changed everything. The present-day festival faded. Ruth's smile slowly dimmed, because the next memory hurt the most. She remembered sitting on the edge of their bed, staring at the pregnancy test with trembling hands. She hadn't planned this. She was scared, yes, but also excited. She imagined little feet running around, imagined raising a baby with love, imagined Stevens's reaction. She thought he would smile. She thought he would hold her and promise they'd figure it out. Instead, "Ruth, I'm not ready," Stevens had said, pacing the small apartment. "You don't have to be ready right this second," she whispered. "We can—" He cut her off, rubbing his temples. "I can't do this. A child? Right now? I'm trying to get my company off the ground. I barely have money. Barely have time. It's not just about you," she snapped. "This is our baby." He flinched, guilt flickering across his face. "Maybe we shouldn't have it." The world stopped. Ruth felt the air leave her lungs. "Stevens, no." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. That somehow made it worse. "I'm scared, Ruth," he said quietly. "I'm scared I can't do this. I'm scared I'll fail. I'm scared I'll resent you. I'm scared this will ruin everything." She remembered staring at him, the man she loved, realizing he was paralyzed by fear, but his fear stung like betrayal. She wrote him a letter the next morning. Not angry, not cruel, just honest. "I can't give up on him. I hope one day you understand why." She took one last look at their apartment, the mismatched furniture, the stack of books they read together, the blanket they both fought over on cold nights, and walked out. Stevens ran after her, calling her name, but she didn't turn back. But because she loved her child more. Back in the present, Ruth blinked hard, clearing the sting in her eyes. She focused on Connor in front of the snow cone booth. He was laughing with a group of kids, wiping syrup from his chin. Watching him brought a mix of pride and sadness. He was growing so fast, growing into a version of life shaped by her choices, her sacrifices, but also shaped by Stevens' absence. Ruth inhaled deeply. She had done everything she could, everything a mother could do. But seeing her son act distant, thoughtful, restless, seeing how curious he'd become, worried her deeply. She walked toward him. "Ready to head out soon? Can we stay a little longer?" Connor asked. His eyes didn't look troubled now. They looked searching, as if he was studying the families around him, comparing something in his mind. Ruth nodded. "Sure, baby." They stayed until sunset painted the sky orange and pink. But on the drive home, Connor stared out the window for most of the ride. When she asked if he had fun, he said yeah, but his eyes told another story. He was thinking again, wondering again, yearning again. And Ruth felt that familiar ache return, the ache of a mother sensing the distance between her love and her child's questions. Later that night, after Connor showered and retreated to his room, Ruth sat alone on the couch. Her mind replayed the flashbacks she had tried to lock away for years. But deep down, she knew something was shifting in Connor's heart, something connected to the man she once loved, the man who became a ghost in their story, the man whose world was calling to their son, even if Connor didn't realize it fully yet. The festival had brought joy, but it also brought memories, and those memories made Ruth more afraid than before. Because the past wasn't finished, it was resurfacing, quietly, steadily, through her son. Night settled over Los Angeles the way it always did, with distant sirens, soft conversations on balconies, and the hum of cars rolling along Sunset Boulevard. The city glowed under flickering streetlights, neon signs, and warm apartment windows. In Ruth's home, the night brought something else entirely, the quiet before a storm she didn't see coming. Connor finished his dinner quickly and disappeared into his room, claiming he had homework. Ruth believed him at first, until she realized he hadn't asked for help the way he usually did. She peeked into his room later and noticed his books untouched on the desk, the lamp casting a small circle of light over blank pages. "Connor," she said gently. "Yeah, Ma? You good?" "Yeah, just tired." His voice was steady, but his eyes flickered with something else. Uncertainty, maybe guilt. She had seen that look before. It was the same look he had when he accidentally broke her favorite mug and tried to hide the pieces under the sink. "Okay," she said softly. "Try to sleep early. I will." She lingered for a moment, wanting to say more, wanting to press him, but she didn't. She simply gave him a small nod and closed the door halfway. As she walked down the hallway, she whispered to herself, "Lord, help me understand what's going on with this child." Then he exhaled the breath he'd been holding. The blue light from his phone screen illuminated his face as he opened a browser he'd hidden behind a school app. And there it was, the page he'd been studying for the past week. A profile, a biography, articles, interviews, Stevens, his father, a man he knew only through stories Ruth carefully chose, photos he found online, and whispers from kids at school who recognized the billionaire's name. Connor had typed that name into his search bar at least 50 times. Stevens' company headquarters, past projects, public appearances, all laid out online like pieces of a puzzle. And the more Connor clicked, the more he wondered why his mother never talked about him unless he asked directly. He scrolled past a news headline that read, "Tech mogul expands global investments, buys hilltop property in Los Angeles." This was the estate Connor had already seen online, the one with towering glass walls, a massive fountain, a private driveway that wound through manicured gardens. It looked unreal, like a place built for people who lived in a different world, a world Connor suddenly wanted to understand. He clicked on the location tab, not the exact address, but close enough. He zoomed in on a satellite view, tracing the neighborhood roads, identifying landmarks, and forming a mental map. He whispered to himself, "I just want to see it. Just once." He wasn't looking for trouble. He wasn't looking for confrontation. He just wanted to stand in front of a place connected to him by blood, by unanswered questions, by a story he didn't fully know. He sat for a long time, staring at the screen, absorbing the image of Stevens standing at a red carpet event, wearing an expensive suit, photographers capturing him from every angle. Connor studied his father's features, the sharp jawline, the familiar shape of the eyes, the slight dimple when he gave a rare smile. He lifted a hand and touched his own cheek. Same dimple, same jawline. His throat tightened. "Why didn't he want me?" he whispered so quietly even he barely heard it. He closed the screen and lay back on his bed, staring at the ceiling. The desire grew, the curiosity pulsed, the frustration burned, and slowly the idea formed. Hours later, when the apartment was finally silent, Connor moved carefully. He listened for the sound of Ruth's breathing down the hall. When he heard her light snore, the one that meant she was deeply asleep, he slid out of bed, grabbed his sneakers, and tiptoed to the front door. His hand hesitated on the knob. "Just one look," he whispered. He stepped outside. Los Angeles felt different at night, cooler, quieter, but still alive. Connor walked with purpose, following the route he memorized from the satellite view. His steps were small at first, unsure, but as he got closer to the wealthier side of the city, he walked faster. The streets changed gradually. Street vendors disappeared. Apartments gave way to gated driveways. The sidewalks widened. Homes grew larger. Polished, landscaped, expensive. Connor swallowed hard. This was nothing like his neighborhood. Eventually he reached the winding hill road that led to the estates. He checked his phone. He was close. He climbed carefully, hiding behind bushes whenever he heard a car approach. The streetlights illuminated sections of the long private road that stretched upward. Around a curve he saw it. Stevens's estate. The gates were taller than he expected, with sleek black bars and security lights hidden under the railings. A long driveway lined with trimmed hedges led to a house that didn't look real, all glass, stone, and careful design. Connor's breath caught. He stared for a long time. Then he saw it, the side wall, not fully hidden but less guarded. Hedges lined the bottom, but they were climbable. His heart thumped. "This is dumb," he whispered, but he moved toward the hedges anyway. He checked for cameras, at least the obvious ones, then crouched low and crawled beneath the bushes until he reached the base of the wall. He started climbing. His hands slipped at first, but he found footholds. The stone grooves helped. He wasn't strong enough to reach the top smoothly, but he made it, sliding over the edge with a soft thud. He stood up in Stevens's backyard. His father's world was suddenly under his feet. Connor's eyes widened as he took everything in. The glowing pool, the statues, the tall glass windows revealing a luxurious interior, the fountain in the center of the yard. He stepped forward, his mouth falling open in awe. Then he looked up. A small, almost invisible security camera blinked. He didn't know if it recorded. He didn't know if someone was watching. He didn't even know where to run. He just knew. It had seen him. Across town, in his office, Stevens reviewed updates on his screens. His estate's security system flickered with a new alert. One of the cameras activated. "What now?" he muttered. He tapped the feed. The image loaded slowly, and his entire world shifted. A teenage boy stood near his fountain, awkward, curious, nervous. Stevens's breath caught. He knew that face. He knew those eyes. He whispered one word, "Connor." His chest tightened. He stood abruptly, knocking over a pen holder. "Maddox," he called, voice sharp. The head of security rushed in. "Sir, is this live?" "Yes, sir." Stevens stared at the screen again, disbelief crushing him. The boy he hadn't seen in more than a decade. The boy whose picture sat hidden inside his desk drawer. The boy he once tried to avoid because facing him meant facing his own failures. Now that boy was standing in his backyard. Stevens's voice broke. "Clear the entrance. I need to go to him. Should I call the police?" "No," Stevens barked. Then he lowered his tone. "No, just let me handle it." He grabbed his keys, ran through the hallway, and burst out the front door. The man who built his life on control was suddenly terrified. Back at the estate, Connor took a slow step forward, unsure where to go. His stomach dropped. He turned toward the house, just as a side door swung open. Stevens stepped out. The two locked eyes across the yard. Neither moved. For a long moment it was only silence. The kind of silence that holds years of questions. The kind of silence that makes history rise to the surface. Stevens took a hesitant step toward him. "Connor," he whispered. Connor didn't answer. He wasn't scared. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even sure what he felt. He just knew this was his father. Ruth's phone rang in the quiet of the night. She jolted awake, heart pounding, and grabbed it. Unknown number. Her voice cracked as she answered. "Hello?" A familiar voice, tight with fear, filled her ear. "Ruth, he's here. Connor is inside my property. Come now." The world spun. Her worst fear, her most fragile truth, her child's secret. Connor had found his father, in the most dangerous, accidental way possible. The second Ruth ended the call with Stevens. She didn't feel the cold tile beneath her feet or the night air slipping through the cracked window. She was already moving, already grabbing her keys, already slipping her shoes on without properly fastening them. The phone trembled in her hand. Her child was somewhere he shouldn't be. Her child was with someone she never expected to see again. Fear didn't just rise, it punched her in the chest. She bolted out of her apartment and down the stairwell, the sounds of distant traffic echoing through the quiet, building as she raced toward the parking lot. Her breath came out choppy, uneven. "Please, God, watch over my son," she whispered as she slid into the driver's seat. Her car roared to life. Her foot hit the gas. She didn't bother checking the time, didn't look at her reflection in the rearview mirror, didn't notice the streetlights blurring past like streaks of gold and white. All she heard was Stevens's voice replaying in her head. "Ruth, he's here. Connor is inside my property." Her fingers tightened on the wheel until her knuckles went pale. The freeway stretched in front of her, the lanes weaving through the late-night quiet of Los Angeles. The skyline glittered in the distance, tall buildings watching silently as she sped past. Other drivers honked, swerved, or slowed down, but Ruth's focus never left the road. She whispered again, "Hold on, baby. Mommy's coming." As she climbed the hill toward Stevens's estate, the entire neighborhood changed around her. These were not homes, they were fortresses. Long driveways, towering gates, polished stone steps. Wealth radiated from every corner. She felt her stomach twist. She hadn't been here in years, not since she walked away, pregnant, heartbroken, determined. But tonight wasn't about the past. Tonight was about Connor. She turned into the private road leading to the estate. The gates were partially open, clearly waiting for her. A security guard motioned her through with a grave expression. "Ms. Ruth, right?" The guard said. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely holding steady. "Where is my son?" "Inside, ma'am. Follow me." Her pulse hammered. She followed the path with trembling hands wrapped tight around her keys, walking fast, almost running. When she reached the mansion's entrance, the tall glass doors opened before she could knock. There he stood, Stevens, older, broader shoulders, eyes that looked exhausted, shaken, and filled with something she didn't dare name. His voice cracked when he said her name. "Ruth," but she didn't answer. Her eyes darted past him, scanning for Connor. Where was he? Was he scared? Was he in trouble? She spotted movement at the foot of the grand staircase, a boy stepping forward slowly, head lowered, shoulders trembling. "Mom," Connor whispered. Ruth rushed toward him so fast she barely felt her feet. She cupped his face, scanned him for injuries, pressed her forehead against his. "Oh, baby. Oh, thank God. Are you okay?" "I'm sorry," he muttered, fighting tears. "I'm so sorry." Ruth wrapped her arms around him tightly. "Don't scare me like that ever again. Ever." Stevens watched, his chest tightening with every word exchanged. Connor clung to Ruth as if she were the only safe thing in the world. She held onto him just as tightly. His breath shook against her shoulder. Only after reassuring herself that her son was whole did she stand up and turn toward the man she once loved. Her eyes were different now, fierce, hurt, protective. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. Stevens swallowed hard. "I saw him on my cameras, the hidden ones on the side of the house. He climbed in through the hedges." "Cameras?" she hissed. "So you were watching my son sneak around in the dark before calling me?" "He didn't sneak around," Stevens replied quietly. He walked right into my world. I had no idea what he was thinking. I was scared for him." Ruth took a sharp breath. "You should be scared. He could have been hurt. He could have been—" I know, he said quickly, eyes down. I know. She stepped closer to Connor and placed a steadying hand on his back. Why did you come here? She asked softly. Connor glanced between them, two parents standing worlds apart. I wanted to see where he lived, he whispered. I just wanted to know what it looked like. Ruth closed her eyes slowly, feeling her heart splinter. Stevens's eyes shimmered with guilt. He stepped forward slightly, then stopped himself. He didn't want to intimidate Connor, didn't want to overwhelm him. Connor, he said gently, why didn't you just ask your mom? Because you never asked about me, Connor said quietly, and I didn't want to bother anyone. Ruth's stomach twisted. Stevens's face fell completely. Bother anyone, he whispered. You could never bother me. You've never been around, Connor replied honestly. The words were soft, not cruel, not meant to hurt, just a statement of truth. He took a small breath. I know, and that's my fault, not yours. The air settled heavy and tense between all three of them. Stevens ran a hand through his hair, pacing slightly before turning to Ruth. I didn't know how to face him, he said. I didn't know how to face you. That's not an excuse, Ruth replied. I'm not giving an excuse, his voice cracked. I'm telling you the truth. The silence simmered. Connor shifted uncomfortably. Stevens's eyes went toward the staircase where the camera feed monitors remained active, glowing faintly in the corner of the hallway. Do you want to see what happened? He asked. The footage? Ruth hesitated, then nodded. Stevens led them into his study, the same room where he had first seen Connor. It was sleek, modern, everything she expected from a billionaire. Shelves of awards, a marble desk, a monitor wall displaying different parts of the estate. Stevens clicked a button. The footage played. There was Connor, crawling through hedges, slipping into the yard, stepping toward the fountain, pausing in awe. Ruth's hand tightened over her mouth. Stevens's voice softened. I didn't know how to react. I panicked. It wouldn't have happened if you had been present in his life, Ruth whispered. I know, Stevens said again, barely audible. The footage ended. The room fell silent. Stevens turned toward them. I'm glad he's safe. I'm glad you're here. I didn't know how much I needed to see him until tonight. Ruth didn't respond. She was afraid her voice might break. Connor's eyes bounced between them, confused, scared, hopeful. The family he never truly had was suddenly standing in one room, forced together by the truth he'd been searching for. And in that moment, Stevens understood the weight of his absence more than ever before. The room felt heavier than the walls around it, a strange combination of quiet and tension, grief and guilt, fear and truth. The study was dim except for the glow from the camera feeds illuminating the edges of Stevens's face. Ruth stood near the monitors, arms wrapped tightly across her chest, trying to steady the storm inside her. Connor stood a few steps away, quiet and unsure, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. His eyes moved between his mom and his father, the confusion on his face unmistakable. Stevens stood near the desk, his shoulders tense, his breath uneven. No one spoke. The silence pressed on all three of them. Finally, Ruth broke it, her voice soft but sharp, trembling with years of emotion she never let herself speak out loud. What were you thinking? She whispered, turning her eyes to Connor. Baby, what made you do something like this? Connor's throat bobbed. He couldn't look at her. I just wanted to see. His voice cracked. I wanted to know why he never wanted me. Stevens flinched like the words were a blade. Ruth's breath hitched. Connor, no, it's okay, Stevens interrupted softly. He's allowed to ask. Connor finally lifted his gaze. Why didn't you want me? You're right here. You have this big house. You have everything. His voice trembled. Why wasn't I part of it? Ruth swallowed back the sting in her chest. Hearing her son say those words, out loud, raw, unfiltered, made her eyes water. Stevens stepped closer, cautiously, like he didn't want to scare either of them. Connor, he said quietly, I didn't stay away because I didn't want you. Then why weren't you here? Connor shot back, and though his tone wasn't rude, it carried the kind of hurt only a child could express so honestly. Why didn't you come to see me, or call, or ask about me, or... Connor, Ruth whispered, reaching for him, but he took a small step back. Stevens took a slow breath. I was wrong. I was scared. I tried to focus on work instead of facing the truth. That's not an excuse, it's just the truth. Scared of what? Connor asked. Stevens's jaw tightened. His voice dropped low. Scared I'd fail you the way I failed Ruth. Ruth blinked, stunned. She didn't expect him to say her name like that, with so much regret behind it. Connor looked between them again, trying to make sense of this new version of events. Ruth turned toward Stevens, her own grief snapping back into place. That doesn't fix anything, she said sharply. You weren't scared. Not back then. You were selfish. You didn't want responsibility. Stevens didn't deny it. You're right. I wasn't ready. Ready? Ruth's voice cracked. I was 22. I was terrified too. But I stepped up. I didn't run. Stevens's eyes softened. I know, Ruth. No, she stressed, tears rising. You don't know. You have no idea what it's like to raise a child alone. You don't know how many nights I cried because I didn't know if I was enough. You don't know how hard it was to tell him good things about you when all I wanted to do was scream. Connor's face fell. Stephen swallowed, hard. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. Ruth, I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't erase what he's felt, she said, voice trembling. It doesn't erase the birthdays you missed, or the questions he asked that I didn't know how to answer. It doesn't erase the years he sat by the window wondering if one day someone might show up. Connor's eyes widened. Ruth had never told him that she cried, or that she struggled. She'd always hidden her pain so he wouldn't feel unwanted. Stephen stepped closer to both of them, but Ruth raised a hand to stop him. You don't get to pretend. This is simple, she said. You don't get to show up now because you were scared. I was scared too, but I didn't quit. Stevens nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. I know. No, you don't, Ruth replied. Because if you knew, if you truly understood, you wouldn't be standing there acting like this is something that happened to you. This happened to us. The room went silent again, charged with emotion, heavy with truth. Connor shifted, his voice small and shaky. Mom, did he really tell you not to have me? The question shattered her. Ruth looked at him, her baby, her miracle, the child she carried and protected before he even took his first breath. She took a breath. Yes, she said softly, he did. Connor's lip quivered. And you still kept me? Ruth kneeled in front of him, tears trailing down her face. Of course I kept you. You were never a mistake. You were mine. You were the blessing I needed when I didn't even know I needed one. Connor broke down and hugged her tightly. She held him close, letting him cry into her shoulder. Stevens watched, chest tight, guilt rising like a tide. He'd seen pictures of Connor. He had followed updates from afar, but nothing compared to seeing the boy in front of him, this child who had grown up without him, who loved Ruth deeply, who carried questions Stevens never answered. Connor pulled away and wiped his eyes. He turned toward Stevens again. Why didn't you fight for me? Stevens's voice cracked. Because I didn't fight for anything back then. I didn't fight for your mother. I didn't fight for myself. I didn't fight for you, and that's something I will regret for the rest of my life. Ruth stood, placing a hand on Connor's shoulder. We're leaving, she said quietly. This is too much for him tonight. Stevens nodded. He didn't try to stop them. He didn't try to explain further. He simply stepped aside. Ruth, he said softly, Can I talk to him tomorrow? Please. Ruth paused, considering. But before she could respond, Connor spoke up first. I don't know, he whispered honestly. I don't know if I'm ready. Stevens nodded slowly. That's okay. Whenever you're ready, I'll be here. Connor looked at him, not with anger, not with forgiving softness, but with uncertainty, with questions, with a longing he didn't know how to express. A longing for something he had never fully had. Ruth exhaled, guiding her son gently toward the door. We're going home. Stevens's voice trembled. Ruth, thank you for coming to get him. She didn't respond. She simply wrapped her arm around Connor and walked out of the estate, holding him close. Stephen stood in the open doorway long after they disappeared into the night. A man finally forced to face the weight of the life he abandoned. And for the first time since Ruth left him all those years ago, he felt the full sting of regret. The drive back to Ruth's apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles inside the chest instead of the car. Connor leaned against the window, watching the city lights blur past like streaks he couldn't name. Ruth drove slower this time, her eyes flicking to him every few seconds, checking, worrying, praying silently that he wasn't slipping into a place she couldn't reach. When they pulled into the parking lot, Connor didn't move at first. He sat still, fingers curled into his jacket, face soft with exhaustion. "You ready to go inside, baby?" Ruth asked gently. He nodded, almost too tired to speak. Upstairs, she walked him into his room. He kicked off his shoes and climbed into bed without even asking for his usual nighttime snack. That alone told Ruth everything. The night had overwhelmed him. She pulled his blanket over him, smoothing it gently against his shoulders. "Mom?" he murmured. "Yes? Are we going to be okay?" Ruth sat on the edge of the bed, brushing his curls with her fingertips. "Yes, baby, we're going to be okay. You didn't do anything bad. You were curious. That's what kids do. But I promise you, we're going to get through this together." Connor nodded, eyes drifting closed. "Mom? Yes, sweetheart, do you think he really wanted to see me someday?" Ruth hesitated, not because she didn't want to answer, but because she didn't want to lie. "I think he's trying now," she said softly, "and we'll take it one day at a time." Connor didn't respond. His breathing slowed, deepened. Within moments he was asleep, his small chest rising and falling with a gentleness that tugged at her heart. Ruth sat there another minute, watching him, remembering the tiny baby she used to rock every night when she had no idea what the future looked like. She kissed his forehead and whispered, "Good night, my love." She stepped quietly out of the room, closing the door halfway, and that's when she froze. Stevens was standing at the end of the hallway. Ruth's breath caught. He was leaning against the wall, hands in his pockets, shoulders slumped. A man who didn't look like a billionaire, didn't look like someone who spent his life surrounded by luxury. He looked tired, drained, almost fragile. "How long have you been standing there?" Ruth asked quietly. "Just a minute," Stevens replied. "I stayed outside until I saw your light turn on. I didn't want the night to end like that." Ruth exhaled slowly, feeling a familiar tension rise in her chest. "Stevens, this is not the time." "I know," he said softly, "but I'm not here to argue. I'm here because there are things I've never told you, things I should have said years ago." Ruth didn't move, but her eyes narrowed with caution. Stevens gestured toward the living room. "Can we talk? Just for a moment?" Ruth hesitated. Every instinct told her to tell him to leave. But something about the look on his face, the vulnerability she'd never seen back then, stopped her. Finally, she gave a short nod. "Fine, but keep your voice down. Connor's sleeping." They walked to the couch. Ruth stayed standing for a moment before finally sitting in the armchair across from him, keeping distance between them. Stevens rubbed his palms together slowly, gathering the words he'd been carrying for years. "Ruth, when you left me, you thought it was because I didn't want the baby, and I know I said things back then that hurt you, things I wish I could erase from the world." Ruth didn't look away. "You asked me to get rid of our child, Stevens. That's not something you can soften." He swallowed. "I know, but I need you to know something I never told you. The real reason I panicked." Ruth didn't respond. She waited. Stevens drew in a deep breath. "When we found out you were pregnant, I was already drowning. My dad had just cut me off financially. I was working 3 jobs and barely keeping up with rent. My mom stopped talking to me altogether because she didn't approve of us." Ruth blinked, not shocked but stirred. "I knew your family didn't like me. But you never said how bad it was. They threatened me," Stevens said quietly. "My mom said if I stayed with you, they'd remove me from every trust, every future investment, everything they planned to pass down. She made it clear that you weren't someone they wanted in the family line." Ruth's chest tightened. "Stevens," his voice broke. "I was scared. Not of you, not of the baby. I was scared of becoming nothing, of failing you, of failing him. I thought if I couldn't provide, you'd resent me. I let fear make the worst choice of my life." He looked down, fingers trembling slightly. "And when you walked away, I told myself it was better, that you'd be happier without me dragging you down. You should have talked to me," she whispered. "You should have trusted me enough to share that." Stevens nodded. "I know, and I regret that more than you can imagine." She leaned back, processing everything. He continued, voice raw. "When I started building my company, I used it as an excuse. I told myself I'd reach out once things were steady, then once I got my first investors, then once I bought the estate, then once the company expanded. But with every year that passed, the guilt got heavier, and the heavier it got, the harder it became to face you. Ruth looked at him, eyes sharp with truth. You could have called, I know. You could have come to see him, I know. You could have shown up for one birthday, one Christmas, one school event. Stevens' shoulders sagged. I know. Ruth's voice softened, but it didn't lose its edge. You left us alone. I carried everything, every fear, every question. Every night he cried because another kid talked about their dad. Stevens' eyes glistened. I failed you, both of you. Ruth inhaled deeply, steadying her thoughts. So why tell me this now? Stevens leaned forward slightly, hands clasped. Because when I saw him tonight, climbing through those hedges, stepping into my world alone, looking so brave and so scared at the same time, his voice cracked. Something inside me snapped. I realized he wasn't just a child I stayed away from. He was my son, and I've missed every moment of his life. Ruth felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition. He wasn't lying. He wasn't rehearsed. This was a man confronting his own history. She rubbed her temples slowly. Stevens, this doesn't change how much he's hurting. I know it doesn't, he replied softly. But I want to be better. For him. For you, if you'll let me try. Ruth looked away, staring at the small lamp glowing in the corner of the room. You can't just show up and expect everything to fall into place, she whispered. Trust doesn't rebuild overnight. I know, he repeated gently. Ruth turned her eyes back to him. And you need to understand something too. This time, I'm not protecting you from the truth. I'm protecting my son. Stevens nodded. I don't expect you to trust me instantly. I just want the chance to try. For the first time all night, Ruth didn't shut him down. She didn't soften, but she didn't close the door. Stevens exhaled slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. Thank you for letting me say all this. I should have told you years ago. Ruth nodded once, still cautious. Get some rest, Stevens. We'll talk tomorrow, maybe. Stevens stood slowly, hesitating before speaking again. Ruth, thank you for raising him. You did an incredible job. She didn't answer. He stepped out into the hallway, pausing as if he wanted to say more, but he didn't. He walked out of the apartment quietly, closing the door behind him. Only when the latch clicked did Ruth finally exhale, sinking into the couch, rubbing her face with her hands. The night had peeled back layers she thought were long sealed. And though nothing was fixed, something had begun, something long overdue. And the truth, the real truth, was finally no longer buried. The next morning arrived quietly, the kind of morning where sunlight seeped through the blinds as if afraid to disturb the house. Ruth stood in the kitchen, stirring oatmeal on the stove as her thoughts drifted between exhaustion and the intense conversation from the night before. The words Stevens said kept echoing in her mind, the confession, the fear, the regret he carried for years. She wasn't ready to forgive him, but she couldn't deny that something had shifted. Connor slept later than usual, worn out from the emotional storm the night before. Ruth let him rest. He needed it. Around mid-morning, her phone buzzed with a message. I'm downstairs. I brought breakfast. Just want to talk. Both of us awake this time. Stevens. Ruth exhaled. Stevens was trying. That alone was new. She stepped outside to find him leaning on his car, holding a white paper bag that smelled like fresh pastries. He looked nervous, almost boyish in a way she hadn't seen in years. Morning, he said softly. Morning, Ruth replied, folding her arms. You didn't have to come. I know, he said, but I wanted to. The sincerity in his voice made something settle in her chest. She hesitated, then nodded toward the stairs. Come in, quietly. He's still sleeping. Stevens followed her inside, carefully setting the bag on the kitchen counter. Ruth poured him a cup of coffee, not because she felt obligated, but because it was something she would have done years ago without thinking. He noticed. You still make it the same way, he said with a faint smile. A little cream, no sugar. Some things don't change, she murmured, taking a seat. He sat across from her. Ruth, he began gently, about last night. Thank you for letting me talk. I know you didn't have to. I heard you. she said honestly, and I believe you meant it. That's all I'll say for now. Stevens nodded, grateful for even that small opening. We had some good times too, he said after a moment, voice softer, before everything fell apart. Ruth looked at him carefully. Why bring that up now? Because, he exhaled, leaning back, I forgot how good it felt to talk to you. I forgot how easy it used to be. Her expression softened despite herself. He continued, do you remember our first date? Downtown LA, that little cafe near the bookstore? Ruth couldn't help the small smile tugging at her lips. The one with the wobbly chairs and the chalkboard menus? That one, Stevens nodded. You ordered sweet tea and laughed when the glass cracked at the bottom. Ruth let out a quiet laugh. I remember you trying to catch the spill with napkins like your life depended on it. You looked at me like I was ridiculous, he said, smiling. But I didn't care. I was nervous. You were the first woman who ever made me feel calm. Ruth looked away, fighting the warmth rising behind her eyes. And do you remember, he continued carefully, the night we stayed up talking until sunrise? Sitting on the floor of your apartment because your couch was too small. Ruth closed her eyes briefly. The memory felt fresh, like a moment she could reach out and touch. That was the night you told me you wanted to build something real, she whispered. A life with purpose. Stevens nodded slowly. You believed in me before I believed in myself, and you believed in me too, she added softly. You used to dance with me in the living room for no reason. He smiled quietly. We didn't even play music half the time. No, she agreed. You'd just sway, and I'd follow. A silence passed over them, not awkward, but full of unspoken truth. Those memories weren't gone. They were just buried beneath layers of hurt, regret, and time. Stevens looked at her with a vulnerability that felt new. Ruth, I wish I could go back to those days, before I let fear make decisions for me. You were prideful, she said simply, and afraid. He didn't deny it. Yes, I was stubborn, hurt, angry. We were young, Stevens. We didn't know how to handle life back then. He stared into his coffee for a long moment. You know, I always thought we would grow old together. His voice dropped lower. I just didn't know how to be the man who deserved that. Ruth's breath caught. The honesty hit deep. Stevens, she said, voice steady but gentle. I don't know what the future holds for you and me, but I know one thing. We can't move forward if you're still looking backward in regret. He nodded slowly. I'm not looking back to regret. I'm looking back because I want to understand what I lost. Ruth leaned slightly forward. And what do you think you lost? His voice cracked. You. The word hung between them, heavy and real. Ruth didn't speak at first. Her eyes softened, but she tucked her emotions away, not ready to unpack them. Stevens went on. I'm not asking for anything today. I just want to be honest. I want you to see that I'm not the same man I was. I can see that, she said quietly, but change takes time, and consistency. I'll prove it, he whispered. They shared a long, meaningful pause. Ruth finally said, Stevens, if we're going to revisit the past, we have to revisit all of it, the good and the painful. I'm ready, he said. She looked at him carefully, searching his face. Do you remember, she asked, the night before I left? How you held my hand and told me you loved me, but you still wanted me to let go of our baby. Stevens's eyes lowered. That was the worst night of my life. It was mine too, she admitted. I walked away because I had to protect myself. And him. He nodded, shame tightening his shoulders. You were drowning, Ruth said softly. But I was drowning too, and we didn't know how to save each other. Stevens looked up at her with something raw in his eyes. Do you think, if things had gone differently, we would have stayed together? Ruth didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle. Stevens, love was never our problem. Timing was. The truth of it settled over them, anchoring itself in the space between their histories and their present. Stevens took a slow breath. Then maybe this time the timing can be better. Ruth didn't smile. But she didn't shut him down either. She simply held his gaze, long, steady, thoughtful. We'll see, she finally said. And for the first time in years, that small sentence gave Stevens hope. The following days felt strange for Ruth, not in a chaotic way, but in a quiet, unfamiliar rhythm that she wasn't sure how to name. Stevens didn't push. He didn't rush. He respected her boundaries, and more importantly, he respected Connor's space. His consistency surprised her. On Tuesday morning, while Ruth was folding laundry in the living room, her phone buzzed with a message. "Can I stop by later? Only if Connor wants me to." Stevens. Ruth stared at the message for a moment, then walked to Connor's room. He was sitting on the floor building a tower with his old Lego set, the same one he insisted he was too old for, but still used whenever he was deep in thought. She leaned against the door frame. "Baby, your dad wants to stop by later, but only if you want him to." Connor paused mid-build. "What would we do?" "Anything you're comfortable with," she said. "Talk, hang out, maybe go for a walk." He was quiet for a long moment, then shrugged. "I guess he can come. You sure?" she pressed. He nodded. "Yeah, but I don't want it to be weird." Ruth smiled gently. "It doesn't have to be weird. Just be you." Later that afternoon, Stevens knocked, softly, almost carefully. When Ruth opened the door, he stood there holding a simple gift bag. "This is for Connor," he said, his voice low. "Nothing big. Just thought he might like it." Ruth stepped aside. "You can come in." Connor peeked from behind the couch. Stevens crouched down so he was eye level with him. "Hey, champ," he said. "I brought you something." Connor approached, cautious but curious. Stevens handed him the bag. Inside was a small tech kit, the kind used to build simple circuits, lights, and sensors. Connor's eyes widened. "You got this for me?" "You like building things," Stevens said with a small smile. "I thought we could try it together if you want." Connor nodded slowly. "Okay." Ruth watched from the kitchen doorway as the two of them sat on the floor. Connor opened the kit piece by piece, and Stevens guided him gently, never taking over or making him feel slow. The dynamic was peaceful, almost tender. "Dad," Connor said at one point, the words slipping out without thought. Stevens froze. Ruth froze. Connor realized what he said and immediately looked up, cheeks flushing. Stevens, sorry." Stevens swallowed, eyes softening. "You can call me whatever feels right. No pressure." Ruth felt her heart twist. The two worked for nearly an hour, getting a tiny light bulb to flicker on. When it finally lit up, Connor grinned for the first time since the night at the mansion. "We did it," he said proudly. Stevens laughed, the sound light and genuine. "We sure did." Ruth leaned against the counter, arms crossed but smiling softly. She hadn't seen Connor this relaxed in days. After they finished, Stevens stood. "Hey, would you two maybe want to go out Friday night? Nothing fancy. There's a little burger place near the pier. Has outdoor seating. Pretty chill." Connor looked immediately at Ruth, silently asking for guidance. Ruth glanced at Stevens. "If Connor wants to..." Connor shrugged again, but this time with a tiny smile. "I'm down." Stevens grinned. "Great. I'll pick you up at 6. Friday came quickly. The evening air was warm with a gentle breeze carrying hints of the ocean. Stevens arrived 15 minutes early but waited patiently outside. When Ruth opened the door, Stevens felt something inside him shift. She wore a simple denim jacket over a soft blouse, her hair pulled back neatly. She wasn't dressed up, and she didn't need to be. She always carried a presence he couldn't explain. Connor joined her, wearing his favorite sneakers. "You guys ready?" Stevens asked, smiling. "Yep," Connor replied. The drive towards Santa Monica was relaxed. They passed street musicians, food trucks setting up for the night, and small groups strolling along the sidewalks. Connor sat in the back seat, looking out the window in quiet curiosity. Stevens glanced at Ruth. "You okay?" She nodded. "Just making sure he's okay." Stevens understood. When they arrived at the burger spot near the pier, Connor jumped out first. The place wasn't fancy, just picnic tables, string lights, and the smell of grilled onions drifting through the air. They sat at a wooden table. Stevens ordered for them, but not before asking Connor exactly what he wanted. "That's new," Ruth whispered with a small smirk. Stevens raised a brow. "What is? You asking instead of assuming?" He chuckled, trying to do better. The food arrived, burgers, fries, fruit drinks, and they ate while the evening crowd buzzed around them. It felt normal, nice, almost like a family outing, but gentler, with space between them where trust was slowly returning. After dinner, they walked toward the pier. Connor drifted several steps ahead, staring at performers tossing fire sticks and couples taking selfies near the railing. Suddenly, Connor stopped and pointed. "Mom, look!" A man nearby was drawing cartoon portraits. The sketches were simple but charming. "You want one?" Ruth asked. Connor shrugged, though the interest was clear. "Maybe." Stephen stepped beside him. "We can get one, all of us." Ruth hesitated. "A family portrait already?" But before she could answer, Connor said, "Yeah, that sounds cool." The artist drew quickly, glancing up every few seconds. Ruth sat still, noticing how close Stephen's was, how their arms brushed occasionally when either shifted slightly. She also noticed how gently Stephen's watched Connor, not with guilt this time, but with something warm, something real. When the portrait was done, Connor held it up. "It looks like us," he said quietly. Ruth took it in her hands, studying it. Stevens leaned over his shoulder, the closeness stirring old memories. "It does," he said softly. On the walk back to the car, Connor walked between them, holding the portrait carefully, as if it were something fragile. At one point, he glanced up at Stevens. "Can we do something tomorrow?" Stevens blinked, surprised. "Tomorrow? Yeah, absolutely. What do you want to do?" Connor shrugged shyly. "Maybe play basketball? Or go to the arcade?" A genuine smile spread across Stevens's face. "Both." Ruth watched the exchange with mixed emotions. Pride, relief, fear, hope. It was a blend she didn't know how to fully interpret. Stevens looked at her as they approached the car. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for tonight, for letting me be here." Ruth nodded. "He needs consistency, Stevens. If you say you'll be there, be there." He met her eyes. "I will," and for the first time in over a decade, Ruth believed him. Over the next week, Stevens became a steady presence, not overwhelming, not intrusive, just present. He showed up when he said he would. He listened more than he talked. He let Connor lead the pace of their growing bond. They went to Griffith Park, where Stevens attempted to throw a football and completely missed the catch, making Connor burst into laughter for the first time in days. They visited a small tech museum where Connor explained half the exhibits before the guide could. They played basketball at a local court, where Stevens realized his son had far more energy than he did. There were awkward moments too, pauses where neither knew what to say, stumbles where emotion got too heavy, but none of it scared Connor away. Ruth watched the shift quietly, observing from the kitchen window as Stevens and Connor kept building circuits together on the living room floor. One evening, Stevens looked up at her. "He's incredible," he said softly. Ruth nodded. "He always has been." Stevens swallowed, going quiet for a moment before whispering, "I don't deserve this chance, but I'm grateful you're letting me try." Ruth didn't reply immediately. She simply looked at him, not with anger anymore, not with softness, but with truth. "You're earning it," she said, and the weight of those 3 words stayed with him long after he drove home that night. For the first time in years, a spark of something familiar, something they once shared. The next Saturday evening arrived with a gentle breeze drifting through Los Angeles. Ruth stood in her kitchen stirring a pot of gumbo, the recipe her mother taught her when she was still a teenager. The smell filled the apartment, warm and comforting, grounding her in a way she desperately needed. It had been a long week, emotional shifts, new rhythms, careful steps, and the unfamiliar presence of Stevens becoming part of their daily patterns. Connor sat at the dining table doodling in one of his notebooks. Every so often he glanced toward the door, then at his watch. Ruth caught the look. "You excited?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Connor shrugged, but the faint smile gave him away. "He said he's bringing dessert. I want to see if he actually picks something good." Ruth smirked. The last time he tried to pick dessert, he showed up with sugar-free cupcakes. Connor made a face. Those tasted like sadness. Ruth burst into laughter, the kind that came easier these days. "Yeah, well, maybe he learned." There was a knock at the door, gentle, not rushed. Connor perked up. "That's him. Walk, don't run," Ruth said, but Connor was already halfway to the door. He opened it, and Stevens stood there in a crisp button-down and jeans, holding a brown bakery box tied with a ribbon. "Hey, kiddo," he said. "I brought actual dessert this time." Connor opened the box slightly and grinned. "Apple pie?" Stevens nodded proudly. Your mom said she liked it back in the day. Ruth froze for a moment, memories slipping into her thoughts, late nights when they'd share a single slice at their old apartment, laughing about nothing, dreaming about the future. Come in, she said quietly. Stevens stepped inside, his eyes meeting hers for just a second, enough for both to feel the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the present. They sat for dinner, and conversation flowed more easily than Ruth expected. Stevens praised the gumbo, even going for a second bowl. Connor proudly showed him the circuitry project they finished earlier in the week. Ruth watched the interaction, the way Stevens leaned in to listen, the way Connor's eyes lit up when he was understood, the way everything felt calmer. After dinner, Ruth cleared the table while Stevens helped Connor with the leftover pie. When Connor finished, he wiped his hands on a napkin and stood. I'm going to go play my game for a bit, he said. Homework first, Ruth reminded gently. Connor sighed dramatically. Fine. He walked off to his room, leaving Ruth and Stevens alone in the living room. The apartment felt quieter now, softer, more vulnerable. Stevens looked at her, his voice low. Thanks for dinner. It meant a lot. Ruth sat on the couch, folding one leg beneath her. It's just dinner, Stevens. No, he replied. It's more than that. I know what it means to be allowed into your space again. I don't take it lightly. She studied him, not with suspicion, but with a cautious openness. How has your week been? She asked. Better than most in a long time, he said. I didn't realize how much I needed this. Needed him. And, he hesitated, needed to clear the air with you. The honesty in his voice made her heart tighten. We're still figuring things out, Ruth said softly. Don't rush the process. I won't, he said. I promise. The room went quiet for a moment. Stevens leaned back slightly, his eyes drifting toward the framed photos on her wall. Connor at different ages, smiling wide, carefree. You did such a good job with him, Stevens said suddenly. I know I keep saying it, but you did. Ruth's throat tightened. I did what I had to do. You did more than that, he insisted gently. You gave him love, stability, joy. You raised him to be confident and kind, and you did it alone. I should have been there. I know that. Ruth turned away slightly, overwhelmed by the sincerity. Stevens, look, we're talking now, we're trying, but don't rewrite history like I didn't struggle. I'm not rewriting anything, he said quietly. I'm acknowledging the truth I ignored for too long. She paused, letting the truth sink in. It was strange, hearing him speak like this after so many years of silence. Stevens continued. Do you remember when we used to sit on the rooftop of your old apartment building every Saturday night, just talking? Ruth nodded slowly. We used to count stars we couldn't even see because the city lights were too bright. Stevens chuckled softly. Yeah. And we'd pretend we knew constellations. We named 3 of them after things we wanted, Ruth said, her voice dipping into memory. A house, a company, a family. Stevens looked down. I got the house, I got the company. But I lost the family because of my own choices. Silence, heavy, honest. Ruth looked at him, really looked at him. You didn't lose us entirely, she said quietly. You walked away. That's different. Stevens nodded slowly, accepting the truth wrapped inside her words. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Ruth, can I ask you something? She watched him carefully. What is it? He hesitated, choosing his words with care. Do you think... His voice softened. Do you think there's a chance for me to earn a place back in your life? Not just Connor's, yours too. Drop. The room stilled. Ruth inhaled sharply, her heart beating in a rhythm she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't surprised he cared. She wasn't surprised he hoped. She looked away, staring at the soft glow of the living room lamp. Stevens, she began slowly. That's not something I can answer right now. He nodded, accepting that without flinching. I understand. But, she continued, lifting her eyes to his, I'm not closing the door. Stevens held her gaze, stunned by the honesty. You're not? No, she said softly. I'm cautious. But I'm not shutting you out. Stevens breathed out, not in relief, but in something deeper. Gratitude. Hope. I want to be better, he said. For him, for you, for the family we could have had. And maybe still can. Ruth didn't respond verbally. Instead, she looked at him, really looked, and for the first time since she left all those years ago, she let herself wonder, could this man truly change? And if he did, could her heart open again? Stevens didn't push. He simply stood up slowly. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for giving me a chance, even if it's a small one." Ruth nodded, one step at a time. He walked to the door, pausing before leaving. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she echoed. He stepped out, closing the door gently behind him. Ruth stayed on the couch, staring at the door long after he was gone. She wasn't in love with him. Not yet, maybe not again, but the truth was undeniable. Something inside her heart had shifted, and Stevens, the man who once shattered her, was slowly stitching himself back into her life. One careful step, one gentle word, one sincere moment at a time. The next week unfolded quietly but meaningfully, a slow, gentle blending of their once's separate lives into something that didn't feel as fragile as before. For the first time in 13 years, Ruth and Stevens found themselves sharing decisions, responsibilities, and the small moments that made up Connor's everyday world. It started on a warm Monday afternoon. Ruth had just stepped out of a grocery store when her phone buzzed. "Stevens, can I pick up Connor from school today? Only if it doesn't disrupt anything." Ruth stood still for a moment, the text glowing on her screen. She hesitated, not because she didn't trust him, but because she wasn't used to sharing this part of her son's life. But Connor had been talking about his dad non-stop lately, how they played basketball, how they built their little circuit light, how he showed him a trick at the tech museum. So Ruth texted back, "Ruth, if he says yes, you can pick him up." A second later, "Stevens, thank you." Ruth exhaled and drove home, feeling a blend of fear, wonder, and something she couldn't quite name. At 3:15 p.m., Stevens stood outside the school gates, hands in his pockets. He looked almost nervous, like a teenager waiting to impress someone. When Connor spotted him, his eyes widened in surprise. "You came?" "I said I would," Stevens replied with a warm smile. Connor grinned, backpack bouncing as he ran over. On the walk home, they talked about Connor's science project. Stevens listened more than he spoke, something Ruth found almost unbelievable when Connor told her later. "Mom," Connor said that evening, "Stevens actually asked what I thought instead of telling me what he thinks." Ruth smiled softly. "That's good, baby." Connor nodded. "Yeah, it was cool." By Wednesday, they had fallen into a small routine. Stevens helped Connor with homework after school twice a week. Ruth joined them sometimes, and other times she let them have their time alone. One evening, while Stevens and Connor worked on math problems at the table, Ruth prepared dinner. Every few minutes she'd overhear Stevens say something that made her pause. "Let's try it your way first. You're better at this than I was at your age." Connor beamed each time. Ruth stood at the stove stirring a pot of pasta sauce, her heart warming in ways she hadn't expected. This simple scene of shared responsibilities was something she thought she'd never have. At one point, Stevens walked into the kitchen holding 2 plates. "He wants seconds," he said, smiling. Ruth raised an eyebrow. "Already?" Stevens nodded. "He said your cooking beats mine by a mile." Ruth smirked. "It always did." Stevens let out a soft laugh, the kind he once had when they were young and everything felt possible. "Need help?" he asked. "You can drain the pasta," she said. Stevens did exactly that, but not without accidentally letting some noodles slip into the sink. "Stevens," Ruth gasped. He looked guilty. "It's been a decade since I last cooked anything that didn't come in a container." She shook her head, laughing. "Good thing you have backup." From the table, Connor yelled, "Mom, did he drop the food?" Stevens whispered, "Don't tell him." Ruth whispered back, "I'm telling him." They traded smiles, small, unexpected, warm. Joint parenting wasn't perfect. Thursday morning, Ruth was rushing to get Connor ready for school when Stevens arrived early. "You're 20 minutes ahead," she said, pulling her hair into a bun. "I know. I wanted to help. Help with what?" Stevens pointed to Connor's backpack. "He forgets his notebooks. Every single time." Connor groaned dramatically. "Mom, he's being extra." Ruth laughed as Stevens tried to zip the backpack but caught the zipper on the fabric, making it jam. "Let me do it," Ruth said, amused. Stevens stepped back, hands raised. "The bag fought me." "You were losing," she teased. Even Connor laughed. He definitely lost. The moment was light and sweet, an easy joy that came from three people slowly learning how to fit into each other's lives again. By Saturday morning, something undeniable had begun growing between all three of them. Ruth woke early to the sound of knocking. She opened the door to see Stevens holding 3 smoothies. "One for you," he said, handing her a mango blend. "One for me. And one for the kid who refuses to eat breakfast unless it tastes like dessert." Connor appeared behind her, rubbing his eyes. "Is that strawberry?" Stevens handed it to him. "Yes." Connor took it with a grin. "You're learning." Stevens looked proudly at Ruth. "I'm trying," and Ruth, though she kept her face calm, felt her chest warm. Later that afternoon, the three of them went to Griffith Park again. Connor insisted on racing Stevens up a hill, even though Stevens clearly wasn't prepared. "Go easy on me," Stevens said, catching his breath. Connor laughed. "No mercy." They ran. Ruth watched from the bottom of the hill, arms folded, smiling as Connor took off like a rocket while Stevens tried, and failed, to keep up. At one point, Stevens slipped slightly on the grass and yelped. "Stevens," Ruth called out. "I'm fine," he wheezed. "Just testing gravity." Connor doubled over laughing. Ruth shook her head, amused and touched all at once. Later that night, Ruth and Stevens sat on a bench while Connor played with other kids nearby. The sky blended from orange to deep blue as the sun set behind the palm trees. Stevens looked at Ruth. "He's amazing." Ruth nodded. "He is. I want to keep doing this," Stevens said quietly. "Not just for a week, not just until things settle down. I want to show up, for real." Ruth looked at him, her eyes soft, cautious, and strong all at once. "We're building something," she said, "but it has to be steady, slow, safe for him." "I'm not running anymore," Stevens replied. "You have my word," and something about the way he said it, calm, steady, unforced, made Ruth believe him in a way she hadn't expected. She didn't say it out loud, but she felt it. Connor wasn't the only bridge forming between them. Stevens was becoming one too. As the night grew cooler and city lights flickered on in the distance, Ruth realized something she'd been trying to ignore. Love doesn't disappear. It doesn't die. It hides. It waits. It softens. It returns when both hearts are finally ready to hold it again. And after 13 years, maybe, just maybe, they were starting to be ready. Sunday morning rose quietly over L.A., the sky soft and clear as if the city itself sensed the shift happening between Ruth and Stevens. The week had stretched them, softened them, pulled them into a rhythm neither expected, but both secretly needed, and today was the first day Connor insisted, no, demanded, they all spend time together again. Ruth watched her son run around the living room looking for his favorite sneakers, his voice echoing through the hallway. "Mom, are you ready? Steven said he wants us to meet by 9. He said we can get breakfast on the way and go to the pier." Ruth raised an eyebrow at how excited he sounded. She couldn't remember the last time Connor woke up this early without being forced out of bed. "I'm coming," she called, tying her hair into a bun. "You act like we're meeting the mayor." "Stevens is cooler than the mayor," Connor replied without hesitation. Ruth laughed softly at that. "You're impossible." "No, Mom," Connor said seriously, grabbing his hoodie. "I'm just happy." Ruth's chest tightened a little. Her son deserved this version of joy, the joy that came from having both parents present even if the situation was still fragile. Stevens arrived exactly on time. He stood outside the door holding 2 coffees and a hot chocolate for Connor, all balanced carefully in a drink carrier. He was dressed casually. Dark jeans, a fitted black shirt, clean white shoes. But what stopped Ruth wasn't the outfit. It was the tension in his jaw, the nervousness in his eyes. Not fear, hope. "Good morning," he said quietly. "Morning," Ruth replied, adjusting her bag. Connor pushed past them with his backpack. "Let's go." Stevens laughed. "Someone's eager." "He's been up since 7, Ruth said. "That makes 2 of us." Ruth blinked. "You hardly sleep early." "I didn't sleep early last night," Stevens admitted. "I had a lot on my mind." The way he said it made her throat warm, but she didn't ask. Not yet. They walked to the car, Ruth settling in the passenger seat while Connor buckled himself in the back, happily sipping his drink. When Stevens started the engine, soft R&B played quietly through the speakers, the same kind of music they used to listen to on long drives when they were young. Ruth noticed immediately. "You still listen to this?" she asked. Stevens kept his eyes on the road. I never stopped. Her heart gave a small, unsteady jump. Breakfast at a small family-run diner near Santa Monica felt strangely natural. They sat in a booth, Connor on one side, Ruth and Stevens on the other, plates filled with eggs, pancakes, and fresh fruit. Connor did most of the talking, animatedly explaining how Stevens had almost passed out running at the park and how Stevens cheats at rock, paper, scissors because he reads facial expressions. Ruth raised an eyebrow. "Is that true?" Stevens looked offended. "First of all, I do not cheat. Second of all, he stares at me like he's trying to decode my soul. I simply prepare—" Connor's laughter shook the table. Ruth shook her head. "Both of you are too much." But even as she said it, she felt warmth climbing her chest. Sharing a meal like this, it felt like stepping back into a world she once had and thought she'd never be allowed to touch again. Stevens kept glancing at her. Not in a pushy way, not with old entitlement, but with a kind of quiet admiration that made her pulse shift. When she caught him staring for the third time, she narrowed her eyes. "What?" she asked. He lifted a shoulder, trying not to smile. "Nothing. It doesn't look like nothing. When I think of something better to say, I'll let you know," he replied. Ruth looked away, her breath catching unexpectedly. The pier was busy but not crowded. Families walking, street performers playing keyboards, the smell of salty air sweeping past them as they made their way onto the boardwalk. Connor ran ahead to look at the arcade machines, yelling back, "Come on!" Stevens leaned in slightly. "He has a lot of your energy." "Energy?" She laughed. "He tries to outrun the sun." Stevens smiled, but it faded almost immediately. "Ruth, can I ask you something? Why didn't you ever tell me he loved building things?" Ruth sighed. "Stevens, you asked me to end the pregnancy." He closed his eyes, guilt pressing into every line on his face. "I know." "No," she said quietly. "You don't know. You didn't just disappear. You created a world where I had to exist without you. Every time Connor asked why he didn't have a dad, I told him to ask God, because I refused to tell him something that would break him." Stevens swallowed hard. "I didn't realize I'd done that much harm." "You did," she said simply, "but you're here now." Stevens opened his mouth to respond, but a small hand grabbed theirs. "Can we ride the Ferris wheel?" Connor asked, excitement bouncing in his voice. Stevens looked at Ruth. She looked back. "Yeah," she said softly. "Let's go." They boarded the Ferris wheel, Connor sitting between them. As the cart lifted higher, the city spread out below them, the ocean glinting under the sunlight. Connor pressed his face against the glass. "This is the coolest thing ever." Stevens smiled, then turned slightly toward Ruth. "Thank you for today." "You don't need to thank me," she replied. "I do," he said, "because I know this isn't easy for you, or for him, and I want to make sure I'm doing things right." Ruth watched him, really watched him. There was no arrogance in his voice, no entitlement, no attempt to rewrite the past, just honesty, just a man trying to figure out how to be a father and how to stand beside the woman he once failed. Stevens exhaled slowly, as if her words loosened something tight inside him. The wheel paused at the top. Silence settled, not awkward, not heavy, but meaningful, soft like a held breath. Stevens whispered, "Ruth, I know I can't undo anything, but I hope, someday, you might let me be part of your life too, not just his." Her heartbeat caught. "Stevens, I'm not asking for anything right now," he said quickly. "I know I have to earn every step, but you're still the person who knew me best, and being around you again, it's reminding me of who I used to be before I ruined everything." Ruth looked at him then, really looked, and the years between them suddenly felt like pages in a book that hadn't fully closed. But before she could respond, Connor shouted, "We're moving again," and the moment broke, not in a bad way, more like a promise that rested between them, waiting. They spent the rest of the day playing games at the arcade, eating ice cream that dripped over fingers, and watching a street drummer who made Connor laugh so hard he almost fell over. Every time Ruth thought the moment might slip into discomfort, Stevens surprised her. He was patient, gentle, focused, present, Not once did he try to take over or control the day. He let Connor lead. He let Ruth decide what felt comfortable. He gave space without disappearing. He stepped forward without crowding her. It was new, and it was working. That evening, Stevens walked them back to their apartment building. The sun had set, streetlights glowing warmly along the sidewalk. Connor hugged him tightly. "Are we hanging out tomorrow?" Stevens smiled. "If your mom says yes." Connor looked at Ruth with pleading eyes. "Mom, please." Ruth tried not to laugh. "We'll talk about it." Connor ran inside. Stevens remained on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, looking at Ruth with quiet sincerity. "Today meant more to me than you know." Ruth nodded slowly. "You handled everything well." "That's because I'm learning from two very strong people." The way he said it, soft, steady, respectful, made her chest feel warm. Stevens took a small breath. "I want to keep showing you who I am now, not who I was." Ruth felt her guard shift, not crumble, not fall apart, but shift, because she could see it. He was different, not perfect, not magically healed, but different, and she wasn't as closed off as before. "Stevens," she said quietly, "I'm trying too, for Connor, and for myself. This is new for all of us." He nodded. "Take all the time you need," he said. For the first time, she believed him. They stood there for a moment, the night air brushing past them, city warmth humming around them, before Ruth finally whispered, "Good night." "Good night, Ruth." She walked inside. He watched her go, and for the first time in years, they both felt the possibility of something they had long buried, a future that might belong to all three of them. Even after Stevens walked away from the curb that evening, Ruth found herself standing inside her apartment longer than usual, leaning on the door with both hands, trying to steady the warmth settling inside her chest. A warmth she once knew, a warmth she never expected to feel again, a warmth that scared her because it felt too familiar. Connor was in his room humming one of his favorite songs, completely unaware of the emotional whirlwind swirling inside his mother. His boyish laughter drifted from the hallway, mixing with the hum of evening traffic outside. Ruth finally lifted her head and exhaled. She wasn't falling back into old patterns, at least she told herself she wasn't. But something in her spirit knew she was standing on a bridge she thought had burned to ashes 13 years ago. Now somehow, it was rebuilding itself plank by plank. The next evening came with a kind of soft breeze Los Angeles only gave during late spring, the kind that carried the smell of food stands, car tires on warm pavement, and faint chatter from neighbors sitting outside on their porches. Ruth stood in her kitchen making dinner when her phone buzzed. "Stevens, I don't want to disrupt your night. Just checking. How are you and Connor doing?" Ruth stared at the message for a moment, feeling a tug inside her chest. This wasn't the old Stevens. That man communicated only through obligations, pride, and surface-level politeness. This message was gentle and thoughtful. She typed back, "We're good. Connor's finishing homework. I'm cooking." A moment later, "Stevens, cooking what?" Ruth smirked. "Gumbo." He responded almost instantly. "Stevens, I'm jealous. I wish I was there for that." She froze. Her heart flipped the way it used to when he said things like that. Things that carried intention but not pressure, affection but not demand. Before she could stop herself, she typed, "You can come by if you want. It's just dinner." Her hands trembled slightly when she sent it. She hadn't planned this. She hadn't rehearsed it. But something about the way he'd been showing up, the consistent effort, the emotional humility, the patience, it made this feel like a step she could take without losing herself. Stevens replied, "Stevens, I'm already on my way." Connor nearly tripped over his own excitement. "Stevens is coming? For dinner? Here? Tonight?" Ruth nodded as she wiped her hands on a towel. "He's just eating with us, baby. That's all." Connor grinned so wide his dimples looked ready to pop. "Can I show him my science project? I want to show him how I coded the sensors." "You can show him after the food's done," Ruth said, though she smiled at how happy her son looked. 15 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Ruth's breath hitched slightly before she opened the door. Stephen stood there wearing a plain gray hoodie, dark jeans, and a nervous smile that made him seem like a man asking permission to step into a memory. "Hey," he said softly. "Come in," she replied. Her voice sounded calmer than her heartbeat. He stepped inside, inhaling the scent of gumbo that filled the apartment. "It smells amazing in here." "It's nothing fancy," she replied. "It doesn't have to be. You always made regular days feel special." That sentence made her fingers go still. Inside the kitchen, Stevens lingered at the counter, watching her with a kind of quiet gratitude. Connor rushed him immediately, pulling him toward his room to show off his project. Their voices blended in the background. Stevens asking questions, Connor explaining proudly. Ruth kept stirring, her heart slowly melting. This was what she wanted for her son. A father who asked questions, who listened, who cared, and maybe, just maybe, a partner who finally understood the weight of what she carried alone for 13 years. Dinner around the small table felt surprisingly natural. Connor ate quickly so he could keep talking about his science project, and Stevens listened with complete focus. Ruth kept catching herself watching Stevens, how he leaned in when Connor spoke, how his smile softened whenever Connor made a joke, how his eyes lifted to Ruth every time she added something to the conversation. There was no tension, no defensiveness, just two parents rediscovering a rhythm they never got the chance to build. After they finished eating, Connor disappeared into his room, leaving Ruth and Stevens on the couch with the television on low volume. A movie played, but neither of them paid attention. Stevens sat on the far side of the couch at first, giving her space. Ruth appreciated that. But 5 minutes in, Connor shouted from the hallway, "Mom, Stevens, come see this." They got up together, watched Connor demonstrate his project, clapped, encouraged him, praised his creativity, and returned to the living room, this time sitting closer naturally without planning it. The apartment felt smaller but warmer. Eventually, Connor fell asleep in his room after promising to finish reading his comic the next day. The apartment quieted, the air settling into a thick peacefulness Ruth hadn't felt in years. She stood near the kitchen sink rinsing a bowl when Stevens stepped beside her. Not close enough to crowd her, but close enough that she could feel his presence. His voice was low. "Ruth, thank you for letting me come." She didn't look at him immediately. It was just dinner. "No," he said, "it was more than that. At least, to me." She finally turned her head, meeting his eyes. There was no arrogance in them, no sharpness, no distance, just sincerity and a deep, aching remorse. "Ruth," he began, voice tighter than usual, "when I said I wanted to earn a place back in your lives, I wasn't trying to sound dramatic. I meant it. I know the kind of man I was, and I don't ever want to be that version of myself again." Ruth swallowed. "Stevens, you broke us both back then, me and Connor." "I know," he whispered. "Every day I spent building my company, every award I received, every deal I signed, it all felt incomplete, like I'd built a life with a giant hole in it, and that hole had your name, and his." Her breath trembled. She placed the bowl down slowly. Stephen stepped closer but still left space between them, letting her decide if the moment had room to grow. "You're trying," she said finally. "I see it." He shook his head. "Trying is the bare minimum. He deserves better. You deserve better." Ruth inhaled deeply, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. "You're here now. That's what matters." Stevens's voice lowered into something warm, careful. "Being here with you tonight, it felt like coming home to a version of myself I lost." Ruth's heart thudded unevenly. The kitchen lights dimmed slightly, casting their shadows closer. The hum of the refrigerator in the city outside became the only sounds. Stevens looked at her, then lowered his gaze with something like vulnerability. "I didn't know if you'd ever allow me near your heart again, but being in your space, seeing how you raised him, seeing how strong you had to be alone. Ruth, I'm ashamed I wasn't man enough to stand beside you." She closed her eyes for a second. "That's the past," she whispered, "but it hurts you even now." She didn't deny it. Instead, she wiped her hands on a towel and walked toward the couch, needing to sit down. Stevens followed slowly, worried he might be pushing too far. When she sat, he sat across from her, giving her full space to breathe. "Stevens," she said quietly, "you and I don't get to jump into anything, not after everything." "I know," he replied instantly. "You hurt me deeply, more than I think you realize." "I do realize it," he said. "I feel the weight of it every time I look at him, Every time I look at you." She nodded. "Then you know I can't rush this. I don't want you to rush," he said. "I just want the chance to prove myself." Silence settled again, but this silence wasn't heavy. It was healing. It was honest. It felt like a step into something new. Ruth finally whispered, "Stevens, I don't know what the future looks like, but tonight was good." Stevens's eyes softened. "It was more than good. You were different today, patient, thoughtful. I'm learning from you," he said, "from both of you." Ruth wiped a small tear she didn't expect. "You can't expect everything to fall back into place." "I don't," he said, "but I'm willing to build it slowly, piece by piece." Her heart responded to those words more deeply than she expected. Stevens leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Ruth, can we try? Not a relationship, not labels, just this, being present, being honest, being careful with each other?" She stared at him for a long moment, searching his face the way she used to when they were young, looking for signs of the old Stevens. But he wasn't there. Instead, she saw a man who had grown through pain, a man who had learned humility, a man who had been reshaped by regret, a man who was finally willing to love without fear. Slowly, she nodded. "Yes," she said softly, "we can try." Stevens exhaled with relief so real it softened his entire posture. "Thank you," he whispered. They sat together on the couch in comfortable quiet, not touching, not rushing anything. The soft glow of the lamp lit the room in warm shades, highlighting the steadiness in their breathing and the gentle beating of hope between them. Ruth leaned back and allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in years, not love, not yet, but possibility. Stevens watched her for a moment, then quietly said, "Whatever happens next, we'll walk through it slowly. Together." Ruth nodded again, her voice gentle. "Together." And for the first time in 13 years, the night did not hurt. It healed. It didn't drag old wounds open. It stitched them carefully, patiently, and when Stevens finally stood to leave, he didn't lean in for anything more. He simply looked at her, truly looked, and whispered, "Good night, Ruth. Thank you for giving us a chance." She smiled softly. "Good night, Stevens." When the door closed behind him, Ruth touched her chest, feeling a quiet ache, a warm one, the kind that only comes when two broken hearts finally decide to try again. Slowly, carefully, honestly, a new chapter had begun, not rushed, not forced, not perfect, but real, and real was enough. Morning light slipped through the thin curtains of Ruth's apartment, landing right across the couch where she sat with a cup of tea in her hands. The night before it had replayed in her mind on a loop. The dinner, the laughter, the soft conversation after Connor fell asleep, and those final words. "We can try. Together." She wasn't naive. She wasn't pretending history didn't exist. But for the first time in a long time, she woke up feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. From down the hallway, she could hear Connor humming and the faint click of his game controller. Life had little pockets of peace now, and she could feel it settling into their home like something earned, not borrowed. Her phone buzzed. "Stevens, morning. How are my favorite two people doing?" Ruth's lips curved. "We're okay. He's in his room. I'm having tea." "Stevens, I was thinking, I want to do something big for him. Not expensive, just meaningful. Do you think he'd want to bring some friends over to the estate? Let them see where he almost got arrested for sneaking in?" Ruth actually laughed out loud at that. He'd love that. "But we keep it simple. No turning it into a circus. Stevens, simple. No circus. Got it. I'll call you in an hour." Ruth stared at the screen for a second longer, then set the phone down and leaned back. The idea of going back to that mansion, this time by choice as a unit, made her stomach flutter. Not from fear, from the significance of it. This time they weren't sneaking in. This time they were invited. This time it was as a family, even if they hadn't labeled it that yet. By the time she told Connor about the idea, he almost dropped his notebook. "You're serious?" he asked, eyes wide. "Yes," Ruth replied, trying not to smile too hard. "Stevens wants you to invite a few friends to his place. Pool, food, games. But you can only invite a small number, and you need to ask their parents properly. No sneaking anybody through side gates." Connor's grin stretched across his face. Can I ask 3? 2, she countered. He tilted his head, bargaining. 2 and maybe 1 more if his mom says yes? Ruth laughed. We'll see. He grabbed his phone, already planning who to text. Ruth watched him, her heart full. Growing up, she'd done everything in her power to give him joy. Ice cream nights, festival days, board games spread across the living room. But she couldn't give him this, a chance to introduce his father's world to his friends without shame. Now somehow that was changing. The day of the gathering came fast. Ruth stood in front of her mirror, smoothing her simple olive dress, making sure it was neat but not flashy. She wasn't dressing for the mansion. She was dressing for herself. For comfort. For confidence. Her hair was pulled back with just enough loose curls to frame her face. Connor burst into her room. Mom, which hoodie looks better, the blue one or the black one? The blue, she said, makes you look bright, and tuck your chain in. You're going as yourself, not a music video. He snorted. Fine. They made their way down to meet Stevens, who arrived right on time in a clean SUV. He stepped out of the car, and Ruth noticed immediately. No suit today, no sharp blazer, just a fitted t-shirt, jeans, and clean sneakers. So much of the old him had been defined by expensive tailoring and image. This version looked more like a man who could sit on the floor, get sauce on his shirt, and not complain. Hey, he said softly as they approached. Hey, Ruth replied. He held the back door open for Connor, who climbed in with energy practically bouncing off him. You ready, champ? Stevens asked. Definitely, Connor grinned. You sure your house can handle it? Stevens laughed. We'll find out. The estate looked different in the daytime. The first time Ruth had arrived there, it had been under flashing nerves and panic, the night pressing in around her. Tonight the sun shined off the glass windows, the pool sparkled, and the manicured lawn looked less like a stage and more like a big, open yard where kids could actually run. A few cars were parked out front already. 2 of Connor's friends stood with their parents near the gate, looking slightly overwhelmed. Ruth recognized them from school events, though she never learned their names, and she didn't need to. Today they were just his friends, bright-eyed and excited. Connor jumped out of the car and jogged over. Hey, you made it! One of the boys lifted a basketball. You weren't lying, man. This place is huge. The parents looked around, a little unsure, until Stevens walked up with an open, respectful smile and extended his hand. Hi, he said. I'm Stevens. Thank you for letting them come. I'll make sure they're safe, fed, and returned on time. That simple, clear, grounded introduction impressed Ruth more than any gala speech he ever gave. The parents nodded, some a bit starstruck but reassured. Ruth stood slightly to the side, watching him, not as the man from the magazines, not as the man who made the hidden camera call in a panic, but as the man who was now showing up as a father, a steady, approachable, present one. She realized her chest had softened again. The afternoon unfolded like a scene from someone else's life, but they were in it, fully present. The kids ran across the yard, tossing the basketball, racing each other to the pool's edge, arguing over who could hold their breath underwater longest. The estate that once felt too large, too empty, too lonely, now echoed with childish laughter. Stevens stood at the grill, struggling to flip burgers without burning them. Turn the heat down, Ruth called from the patio table, laughing. It is down, he protested, squinting at the controls. Why does it feel like this thing has more settings than my servers? Because you're used to machines that don't smoke in your face, she teased, walking over. She took the spatula gently from his hand. Move. Yes, ma'am, he said, stepping aside with a grin. Connor yelled from the pool. Mom, don't let him ruin the food. Ruth leveled a playful glare at Stevens. You heard the boy. I'm being persecuted in my own house, he muttered, but he was smiling. She flipped the patties with ease, years of practice on modest stoves and borrowed grills showing in the way she judged the heat just by scent and sound. Stevens watched her, a mix of admiration and guilt flickering across his face. You really held everything down, didn't you? He murmured. Ruth didn't look at him. Someone had to. A beat passed. I should have learned, he said. I should have been beside you at some random apartment grill somewhere instead of at rooftop parties pretending everything was fine. Ruth's jaw clenched, but not in anger this time. In recognition. You're learning now, she said finally. He nodded. I am. And believe it or not, I'm more nervous about impressing these kids than any investor I've ever met. She laughed. That means your priorities are shifting. He smiled softly. They are. Later, when the sun dipped lower, the kids gathered around a long outdoor table. Burgers, fries, sliced fruit, and cold drinks filled the space between them. Connor, cheeks flushed from the pool, sat at the head of the table like he owned the place. One of his friends looked around and said, "Dude, your dad's house is crazy." Connor glanced at Stevens, then at Ruth, then back at his friends. Something thoughtful settled on his face. "It's not just his house," Connor said quietly. "We're all figuring it out." The friend blinked, then shrugged and reached for more fries, not realizing how heavy those words really were. Ruth, however, felt them land deep. Stevens did too. His eyes met Ruth's for a moment, a silent acknowledgement of everything behind that simple statement. The years of absence, the slow return, the rebuilding. Later, when the kids were back in the pool, Connor shouted from the deep end, "Stevens, get in!" Stevens put his hands up. "Oh no, absolutely not. I did not bring a change of clothes. No one said you need one." Connor grinned. Ruth raised a brow. "Oh, this I have to see." Before he could protest, one of the boys splashed water at Stevens's legs. He danced back, laughing. "Stop! This shirt is expensive," he said. Ruth crossed her arms. "You realize you sound like you used to, right?" He paused, looked at her, then looked at Connor. Then, without warning, he kicked off his shoes, pulled off his watch, and jumped, fully clothed, into the pool. The boys exploded in laughter. Ruth's jaw actually dropped before she burst out laughing too, the sound full and bright. Stevens resurfaced, hair slicked back, shirt clinging to him, grin wide. "You happy now?" Connor laughed so hard he had to hold onto the edge. "That was awesome." Ruth shook her head, smiling. "You're going to regret that when you see the laundry." "I'll buy a new washer," he replied. "That's not the point," she said. He treaded water, eyes still on her. "I know. The point is he'll remember this before he remembers some fancy car I bought." That answer made her heart do something she wasn't ready to name. As the evening pressed in and the sky turned muted shades of pink and blue, parents came one by one to pick up their kids. Stevens walked each family out, thanked them again, assured them their children had been great guests. Ruth watched him from the foyer as he spoke with a quiet humility that didn't exist in the version of him she once knew. This wasn't a man performing. This was a man trying. When the last car pulled away, Connor flopped onto the couch in the massive living room, still damp from the pool, hair messy, a contented smile lingering on his face. "Best day ever," he said dreamily. Ruth sat beside him, brushing her hand over his curls. "You had fun?" He nodded. "Yeah, it felt normal, like this is what we were supposed to be doing the whole time." Stevens stood nearby, his expression bittersweet. Ruth looked up at him. "You okay?" He nodded slowly, "Just realizing how much I missed, and how much I want to protect this now." Connor glanced at him, eyes soft but clear. "You did good today," he said. Those 4 words hit Stevens harder than any business award ever had. "Thanks, buddy," he replied, voice rough. Ruth could see it, the sheen in his eyes, the way he pressed his tongue to the side of his cheek to keep emotion from spilling out. For the first time, she witnessed him as a father in motion, not just a man feeling guilty in hindsight. She saw him, grilling badly, but trying, talking to parents with respect, letting Connor shine instead of putting himself in the spotlight, jumping into the pool just to make his son laugh. And something inside her finally whispered, "This is what it looks like when people change, not with speeches, with actions." When it was time to leave, Connor protested. "Do we have to go?" he asked, looking between them. Ruth smiled. "It's a school night. You need rest." Stevens crouched beside him. "We'll do this again, I promise." Connor studied him. "You're not just saying that, right?" Stevens held his gaze. "I'm learning not to say things I don't mean." Connor nodded slowly. "Okay." They said their goodbyes. Connor walked toward the car, humming quietly. Ruth lingered for just a moment longer at the doorway. She looked at Stevens, her eyes calm, clear, and full of unspoken truth. "You did good today," she echoed her son's words. He swallowed. "Think I'm starting to get the hang of this. You made it about him," she said. "Not about you. That's what being a father looks like." He nodded quietly. "I'm not going back to who I was, Ruth. Ever." She held his gaze. I'm starting to believe that, she said, and as she turned to join her son, leaving the estate behind for the night, she didn't feel like a visitor looking into someone else's world. For the first time, it felt like they were all building something that actually belonged to them. Not just a house, a family. The morning after the gathering at the estate, Ruth woke to a quiet apartment, the soft hum of traffic drifting in through the cracked window. Connor was already awake, shuffling inside the kitchen, humming the same tune he'd been humming ever since the pool party. She could tell something had shifted in him. Confidence, relief, a different kind of happiness. The kind that came from finally having both parts of his world in the same room without tension, without fear, and without pretending something was broken when it wasn't anymore. Ruth stepped out of her room in her robe. Connor stood at the counter pouring cereal into a bowl. "You're up early," she said. He shrugged. "Couldn't sleep too long. Yesterday was cool." She smiled. "I'm glad you had fun." Connor hesitated, spoon halfway to his mouth. His voice dropped. "Do you think Stevens liked hanging out with me?" The question cut into her in a way she didn't expect, not because she doubted the answer, but because it made her realize how long this child had been waiting to ask it. She sat beside him and touched his shoulder. "Baby, he loved it. He's trying to be here for you, and he's not pretending." Connor stared at his bowl for a moment. I wanted him to be real." Ruth blinked. "Real. Like, not just the guy with money or a big house or someone you talk about from the past," he continued. "I wanted him to be real in my life." Ruth swallowed, her hand tightening on his shoulder. "He's trying to be real now." Connor nodded slowly. "I know." The phone buzzed on the counter. "Stevens, good morning. When can I see you two today?" Ruth smirked. "He's really trying," she murmured. Connor peeked over her shoulder. "Can we go, please? He told me yesterday he was going to show me the studio where he comes up with ideas." She laughed. "You're excited?" Connor nodded so hard his curls bounced. "Yes," she typed back. "Give us 2 hours," Stevens responded almost instantly. "Perfect. I'll have breakfast waiting." Connor's grin widened so much his cheeks hurt. Ruth shook her head, but her smile was gentle. This was what she had always wished for her son. Not luxury, not grand gestures, but peace, belonging, the feeling that he didn't have to tiptoe through his own father's existence. Ruth and Connor arrived at the estate a little past 10. Stevens waited by the door, wearing simple clothes again. No suit, no perfectly pressed shirt, no spotless designer shoes. Just a regular man opening his home to his family. "Good morning," he greeted them, his smile warm. Connor sped past him into the foyer. "What's for breakfast?" "Pancakes, eggs, fruit, and whatever else your appetite demands," Stevens replied. Connor disappeared toward the dining area. Stevens turned to Ruth, and for a moment neither said anything. They didn't need to. There was an unspoken acknowledgement between them, a recognition that yesterday wasn't luck, it was effort. "You look tired," he said softly. She laughed. "That's what being a mother does." He nodded slowly. "I'm learning." They walked toward the dining room together. Breakfast unfolded like something out of a childhood that had been postponed but was now rushing to catch up. Connor ate like someone who had been starved of a father's presence, even though Ruth had fed him every form of love she could. And Stevens? He sat with his arms on the table, leaning in whenever Connor spoke, nodding, laughing, asking questions. No distractions, no phone, no excuses. "So you're telling me," Stevens said, trying not to laugh, "that your teacher actually told you penguins look like spies?" Connor nodded with full seriousness. "She said if they wore tiny hats, they'd look suspicious." Stevens laughed so hard he had to hold his stomach. Ruth laughed too, though she'd heard that story twice already. Today it sounded better, fuller, because now she wasn't carrying the weight alone. Connor wiped his mouth and pointed toward the back hallway. "Can we see the studio now?" Stevens nodded. "Let's go." He led them down a hallway Ruth had never been down before, through glass doors and into a bright workspace filled with screens, whiteboards, and scattered notebooks. The walls were covered with sketches, diagrams, project ideas, bits of technical notes, and reminders to himself in thick marker. "This is where the ideas happen," Stevens said. Connor stepped inside slowly, like he was entering a universe made just for him. Ruth watched from the doorway as Stevens showed the boy prototypes, early drafts of programs, and digital tools he used for designing. Connor's eyes lit up at everything. Ruth stood silently, heart swelling. This was the man she fell in love with at 22, the man who talked about changing the world while eating ramen noodles in their tiny kitchen. He hadn't lost that spark. He had just buried it under achievement and fear. Now he was reclaiming it, not for the world's approval, but for his son's. Connor pointed to a whiteboard filled with messy handwriting. "Did you write all that?" Stevens nodded. "Most of it. It looks like your brain spilled out." Stevens laughed. "It did." Connor walked over and traced one of the lines. "You think I could do stuff like this when I grow up?" Stevens knelt beside him, eyes soft. "You can do anything, and I'll be right here helping you figure it out." Connor stared at him. Not the way children stare at heroes, not the way they stare at strangers, but the way they stare at someone they want to trust, someone who has begun earning it. Hours passed. Good hours, warm hours, hours stitched with laughter and tiny revelations. Eventually, Ruth suggested they take a break by the patio. Connor stayed behind in the studio, tinkering with a new digital tool Stevens had shown him. Stevens and Ruth walked outside. The air was calm, sunlight glinting off the pool water, palm trees swaying faintly. Ruth sat in one of the chairs. Stevens took the one across from her, leaning forward slightly. "Thank you for letting me be in his life now," he said quietly. "You're doing the work," she replied. He looked down at his hands, rubbing his thumb over his palm. "Ruth, I think about that night, about the things I said, the fear I hid behind. I can't believe I pushed you away like that. I can't believe I told you what I told you." Ruth's face softened but stayed steady. "Fear makes people say the wrong things, sometimes the worst things, but you didn't deserve that," he said. "You were brave." "I was a coward," she sighed softly. "Stevens, we can't rewrite history," he shook his head, "but I can write what happens from here." Her breath caught. He continued, voice trembling slightly. "Yesterday, being with him, being with you, I realized something. I realized I've spent 13 years trying to fill my life with achievements because I lost the one thing that mattered, the life I could have had with you, the years I missed with him." Ruth held his gaze. "Stevens, no, let me say it," he whispered. "You loved me, you trusted me, and I broke that. The least I can do now is apologize the right way." She swallowed, bracing herself. He leaned back, hands trembling slightly. "Ruth, I'm sorry. For everything, for not being there, for choosing fear over love, for making you walk away alone, for missing birthdays, for missing first steps, for missing life. I'm sorry." She'd imagined this moment before, imagined him apologizing, but never like this, never with this level of truth, vulnerability, and humility. She blinked back the sting of tears. "I carried so much hurt," she whispered, "so much anger. I had to be both parents. I had to smile for him even when I cried at night. I had to pretend I wasn't scared." Stevens looked broken and whole at the same time. "I know, no," she said gently. "You didn't, but you're starting to." Silence settled, not heavy but healing. A silence made of shared pain, shared growth, and shared possibility. Then Ruth asked quietly, "Have you apologized to Connor?" Stevens froze. "I told him I was sorry in small ways," he said. "But not directly, not fully, and he deserves that." Ruth nodded. "Yes, he does." Stevens inhaled deeply. "Then I'll do it today." They found Connor still in the studio, typing on a screen, his tongue slightly poking out in concentration. "Champ," Stevens said gently, "can we talk for a second?" Connor looked up, confused but curious. "Okay." Stevens sat on a rolling chair. Connor sat on the stool next to him. Ruth stood by the door, watching. Stevens cleared his throat, looking at his son with eyes full of truth. "Connor, I owe you something. Something big." Connor blinked. "What?" Stevens' voice shook. "An apology." Ruth's breath hitched. Connor tilted his head, eyebrows knitting. "For what?" Stevens looked at him gently. "For not being here. For not being the father you deserved. For making choices that made you grow up without me. For letting pride and fear get in the way of loving you the way I should have." Connor swallowed. Stevens leaned forward. "You didn't do anything wrong. Nothing about you made me leave. My mistakes were about me, not you." Connor stared at him, eyes glistening. Stevens continued, "I don't expect you to forgive me today, or tomorrow, but I want you to know I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere again." For a long moment, Connor just stared. No sound, no movement. Then he whispered, "I wanted you." Stevens closed his eyes as tears gathered. "I know, and I'm sorry I wasn't here when you needed me." Connor sniffed. "You're here now." "Yes," Stevens said, voice cracking. "I am." Connor stood up. Stevens did too. Connor stepped forward and leaned into him. Not a full hug, but a small, hesitant, scared, hopeful one. Stevens froze for half a second, then wrapped his arms around his son with more care than he had ever shown anyone. Ruth pressed a hand to her mouth, tears falling silently. This was the moment she had waited for 13 years. A real apology, a real connection, a real rebuilding, not from nostalgia, but from maturity. Later, as the sun dipped low and cast warm orange light across the estate, Ruth and Stevens stood outside watching Connor run across the yard. Ruth spoke softly. "You did something powerful today." Stevens shook his head. "He did something powerful. He gave me a chance." Ruth smiled softly. "We all are." He looked down at her, taking in her features, her calm strength, her gentle resilience. "Ruth," he whispered, "can I ask something?" She faced him, his voice softened. "Do you think we're really rebuilding?" She felt her chest warm. "Yes," slowly, "but yes." He nodded, relief softening his expression. Ruth's voice lowered. "Maybe forgiveness isn't about forgetting. Maybe it's about choosing to move forward." Stevens smiled, eyes warm. "Then I'll keep choosing it. Every day." In that moment, Ruth realized something important. They weren't fixing the past. They were forging the future. And for the first time, it felt like a future they all deserved. The weekend arrived with a kind of soft California sunlight that felt like a blessing, spreading gold across rooftops and making the world feel strangely gentle. Ruth stood at her kitchen counter, packing a bowl of sliced fruit, some cornbread wrapped in foil, and a small container of her homemade glaze that Connor swore tasted better than anything he'd ever bought from a store. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't anxious. Today felt like a milestone, one she didn't want to overlook. Connor darted around the living room, checking his backpack for the 10th time. "Mom, are you sure I don't need to bring my project? Steven said he wanted to show me something today." Ruth smiled. "Your project is saved on his computer already. You're good." He nodded, bouncing on the balls of his feet. Okay, I'm just excited." Ruth paused, her hands resting on the counter. "I know." He looked at her, his expression suddenly softer. "Mom, are you excited too?" She hesitated, just enough for him to notice. Then she smiled and tapped his chin. "Yeah, baby. I am." Today wasn't just a visit. It was the first day that felt like a rebirth of something none of them knew how to name yet. Stevens's estate looked different now, not because the building had changed, but because their relationship to it had. The first time Ruth came here, panic gripped her chest. The second time, caution guided her every step. The third time, she scanned the place for signs of safety, for signs of sincerity. But today she stepped out of the car without fear, without doubt riding on her shoulders. Stevens stepped outside at the exact moment they pulled up, as though he'd been waiting at the door. He wore a simple shirt, casual joggers, and the gentlest smile she had seen on him in years. "Good morning," he said quietly, but his eyes were fixed on them like the sight of them brought peace to his heart. "Hi," Ruth replied, matching his calm tone. Connor jumped out of the car before Ruth could even shut her door. "Stevens, did you do the thing you said you were going to do?" Stevens chuckled. "I did. It's ready inside. What is it?" "You'll see." Connor nearly sprinted through the door. Ruth shook her head, laughing. "Lord, help that boy." Stevens stood beside her at the entrance. "He's been texting me ideas for 2 days straight." Ruth raised a brow. "I bet." He glanced at her, then offered his arm, not assuming she'd take it, not pressuring her, simply making space. She didn't take his arm, but she walked alongside him willingly. Some steps didn't need to be rushed. Some closeness needed time, and both of them respected pace. Inside, the estate felt warmer, lived in, no longer a museum of achievements. Stevens led them toward a large room at the end of a hallway Ruth had never explored before. "Close your eyes," Stevens said. Connor frowned. "Why?" "Just trust me," Stevens said softly. It wasn't a demand. It was a request. A humble one. Connor exchanged a look with his mother, then let his eyelids drop. Ruth followed, resting her hand lightly on Connor's back. Stevens opened the door, and warm light spilled out. "Okay," he whispered. "Open." They did. The room was transformed, not with expensive things, with meaningful ones. A large whiteboard stood against one wall with our projects written across the top in bold letters. Beneath it were 3 sections. Connor's ideas, Stevens's ideas, family ideas. A shelf underneath held new notebooks, 3 of them, labeled with their names. On the far wall, framed photographs hung in an arrangement that felt like a timeline. Ruth gasped softly when she realized what they were. A photo of tiny toddler Connor, the one she had sent Stevens years ago. A photo Stevens secretly kept of Ruth from their college days, smiling with her hair blowing across her face. A new photo taken last week, of the 3 of them eating dinner together at a simple restaurant, unaware Stevens had captured it on his phone. Below it all, sitting on a small table, was a printed quote. "A family is something you build, not something you inherit." Connor's mouth dropped open. "Stevens, did you really do all this?" Stevens nodded, hands in his pockets, almost shy. "I wanted you to have a space here. Both of you." Connor walked toward the whiteboard, fingers trailing across the words. "I have my own section." "You do," Stevens said, "and it's yours to use any time. Can I add stuff today? Anything you want?" Connor grinned so brightly Ruth thought her heart might burst. Stevens then turned to her. "Ruth, I wanted you to see that I'm not making empty promises. I want this space to reflect our lives, not just mine. A place where all 3 of us can grow." Ruth blinked back, the sting rising behind her eyes. "Stevens, this is beautiful." He exhaled softly, relief washing over him. "I hoped you'd think so." She walked slowly around the room, absorbing every detail, the notebooks, the pictures, the whiteboard, the small plant in the corner, obviously placed there for aesthetic balance, but slightly crooked. She chuckled. "You bought a plant," she teased. He rubbed the back of his neck. "It's alive, for now." She laughed softly, and in that moment, it hit her. He wasn't just trying to be a father, he was trying to be a partner, the kind he had never learned how to be at 22, the kind he was finally ready to become at 38. While Connor eagerly filled the board with new ideas, "Make a robot that folds laundry" was written in handwriting far too large. Stevens and Ruth stepped out into the hallway. Stevens leaned against the wall, folding his arms softly. "He's really special, Ruth." "I know," she said. "He gets that from you." Ruth tilted her head. "He gets stubbornness from you." Stevens laughed quietly. "Probably true." Silence hovered for a moment, not tense but full of things unsaid, full of emotions carefully layered, full of years that now felt like stepping stones leading them back here. Then Stevens spoke again, voice lower. "Ruth, can I tell you something I realized yesterday?" Her eyes met his. "What is it?" He swallowed. "Love doesn't vanish. It just hides behind pain until you're ready to see it again." A tremor ran through her chest. He continued, not moving closer, respecting the space between them. "I loved you then. I was too scared to say it, too scared to trust it, too scared to build a life with you before I even understood myself." She blinked. One tear slipped down. "And now?" she whispered. His voice softened into something vulnerable, something earnest. "Now I'm older. I'm not running anymore. I'm not hiding, and I'm not letting pride control me. I want you in my life. Not for nostalgia, not for a second chance at being young again, but because I finally know what it means to love someone the right way." Her breath hitched. "Stevens." He stepped gently closer, not touching her, letting her feel the sincerity in the space between them. "You don't need to say anything now. We'll take this slowly, but I want you to know, I'm choosing us, not just because of the past, not just because of Connor, but because I see the future we could have." Ruth closed her eyes briefly. A future? Yes, he said softly. One with peace, with partnership, with laughter, with everything we missed before. Her voice barely left her throat. I want that too. He inhaled deeply, like those words carried a weight he'd waited years to feel again. Ruth finally looked up at him, and for the first time in years, she saw not the man who broke her heart, but the man who was ready to protect it. Later that evening, they took a slow walk through the estate's garden. Connor ran ahead with a small drone he'd brought, letting it buzz around the walkway while laughing loudly. Ruth and Stevens followed at a comfortable pace, side by side, the sun dipping behind the hills, painting the sky with soft streaks of pink and orange. The wind rustled through the tall trees, and for a brief moment, everything felt aligned, like life had taken its long curved route to bring them to this exact moment. Connor raced back toward them, breathing hard. Mom! Stevens! Look! He pointed to the drone now hovering in front of them, a small camera on it capturing their faces. It's recording, Connor said proudly. I wanted to save this moment. Ruth and Stevens shared a look that held years of emotion, regret, healing, love, forgiveness, rediscovery, and something new rising beneath it all. They stood beside each other, Connor between them, all three captured in the frame of the drone's camera, the kind of moment that didn't need fancy words or rehearsed speeches. It simply existed, and it was enough. The drone beeped and landed gently on the grass. Connor picked it up and held it to his chest. Can we keep this video? Stevens rested a hand on his son's shoulder. We'll keep all of them, every new memory. Ruth swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. This feels like a new beginning. Stevens nodded. Because it is. They stood there, the three of them, a family that once fractured, now finding its way back together, not out of necessity, but out of choice, out of growth, out of love rebuilt with maturity instead of fear. The sky dimmed, lights flickered on across the mansion grounds. Connor squeezed both their hands without realizing he'd done it. Ruth looked at Stevens. Stevens looked at her. Their son held them together, a family, rebuilt, and as they walked back toward the house, slow, steady steps, the narrator's voice would close the story with truth. Sometimes life breaks us to help us rebuild stronger. Sometimes love returns when pride finally steps aside. And sometimes the family you think is gone forever is the one waiting patiently for you to come home. Before the screen fades out, if this story touched your heart, please like this video, comment your thoughts, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that second chances are real. Your support helps Stories by Mr. Flex grow and reach more amazing viewers like you.